The town said a woman with hammer-scarred hands could never be loved. They were wrong. When Evelyn Hart's father died, she inherited more than a forge. She inherited a curse. In 1883 Fairfax, California, a woman who could bend iron was considered broken herself. They whispered she'd die alone, that no man would want arms stronger than his own. But then a stranger rode into town, and everything they believed about strength, beauty, and what makes a woman worthy began to crack like cold metal under fire. Stay until the end to see how one woman's courage changed an entire town. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and let's begin. The hammer fell at dawn. Evelyn Hart had been awake for 2 hours already, stoking the forge fire until the coals glowed like captured sunset, arranging her father's tools the way he'd taught her, tongs on the left, hardy tools within arm's reach, water bucket close enough to hear the hiss when hot metal met its surface. The familiar routine kept the ghosts quiet. Most mornings, anyway. She lifted the 5-pound hammer and brought it down on the horseshoe blank with practiced precision. The ring of steel on steel echoed through the morning air, carrying across the quiet streets of Fairfax like a bell announcing something the town didn't want to hear. She's still here, still working, still refusing to disappear. Sparks scattered across her leather apron. Sweat already traced paths through the soot on her forearms, those arms that had become the subject of so much talk. Too thick, they said. Too defined. Muscle that belonged on a man, not wrapped in calico and confined to a parlor. At 22, Evelyn had stopped pretending she cared what they said. Stopped pretending, but not stopped hearing. Strong as an ox, Mrs. Henderson had announced last month at the general store, loud enough for half the town to absorb. Poor thing, what man would want to wake up next to that? Evelyn had kept her eyes on the nails she was purchasing, counting out coins with fingers that could bend iron but trembled slightly as they touched the counter. She'd learned long ago that defending herself only made it worse. Better to swallow the hot coal of humiliation, let it burn where no one could see. The horseshoe began to take shape under her hammer. This would be for Thomas Wright's mare. The gelding had thrown a shoe yesterday, and Wright needed the animal ready for the morning supply run. He'd dropped the horse off after dark, as he always did, conducting his business with Hart's Forge the way a man might visit a doctor for an embarrassing ailment. Necessary, but nothing to advertise. She plunged the glowing metal into the water barrel. Steam hissed and billowed, momentarily obscuring the world beyond her workshop. For just a moment, inside that cloud, Evelyn existed alone. Not watched, not judged, not measured against every other woman in Fairfax and found wanting. The steam cleared. The world returned. Across the street, she caught movement in the window of the boarding house. Mrs. Caroline Pritchard, standing back from the curtain, but not quite far enough. Watching. Always watching. The older woman's face held that particular expression Evelyn had learned to recognize, the one that mixed pity with satisfaction, as if witnessing Evelyn's continued existence as an unmarried blacksmith somehow validated every proper choice Mrs. Pritchard had ever made. Evelyn turned away, fitting the horseshoe to the Pritchell to punch the nail holes. Her father's forge had stood on this corner for 30 years. When pneumonia took him 18 months ago, everyone assumed she'd sell. A few of the men in town had even made offers, their tones suggesting they were doing her a favor by relieving her of such an unsuitable burden. She'd refused everyone. "You'll starve," Samuel Crawford had told her, his mustache bristling with the certainty of a man who'd never questioned his own place in the world. "A forge isn't woman's work, Miss Hart. Your father would want you provided for, not struggling like some—" He'd paused, searching for a word that sounded kind while meaning its opposite, like some common laborer. What Samuel Crawford didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Evelyn's father had taught her the trade precisely so she wouldn't need providing for. "Never let your living depend on another person's mercy," he'd told her, his hands guiding hers on the hammer when she was barely 10 years old. "Learn to make things people need. Iron doesn't care if you're a woman. Fire doesn't judge. Master the craft, and you'll always have a place to stand." She'd mastered it, and they hated her for it. The problem wasn't competence. Evelyn knew her work matched or exceeded what any blacksmith in the territory could produce. The problem was visibility. Every ring of her hammer announced her refusal to disappear, to remarry, to transform herself into something more digestible. She was a daily reminder that women's lives didn't have to follow the prescribed pattern, and nothing disturbed a town's peace quite like a living alternative to its certainties. By mid-morning, she'd finished Wright's horseshoe and 2 others for the Jacobson brothers' plow horses. The work steadied her, the way it always did. There was honesty in iron. It responded to heat and pressure according to immutable laws. Treat it right, and it became what you needed. No deception, no performance, no pretending to be smaller than you were to make others comfortable. She was checking the temperature of the forge when she heard boots on the hard-packed dirt of her yard. Heavy steps, purposeful. A man's tread. Evelyn didn't look up immediately. She'd learned that too, never appear eager for business, never seem desperate for the work they could so easily take elsewhere. Let them wait. Let them see her absorbed in her craft, competent and complete unto herself. Forge open? The voice was unfamiliar, roughened by trail dust and distance. Evelyn straightened, pushing a strand of dark hair from her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of soot she didn't notice. The man standing at the edge of her workspace was tall and spare, weathered in the way of someone who lived more outside than in. Trail dust covered his clothes, and his horse, a rangy buckskin gelding, stood hip-shot behind him, favoring its left front hoof. But what stopped Evelyn's breath for half a second wasn't his appearance. It was the way he looked at her. Most men, when they first encountered her in the forge, went through a visible sequence of reactions. Surprise because they'd expected her father or a hired man. Uncomfortable assessment, as they took in her leather apron, her soot-marked face, her undeniable physical presence. Then either poorly concealed disdain or exaggerated courtesy meant to signal they weren't like other men. They didn't judge, even though their eyes always told a different story. This man did none of those things. He looked at her the way he might look at any craftsman, with the straightforward evaluation of someone who needed work done and was determining whether she could do it. His gaze traveled past her to the forge, the arranged tools, the horseshoes cooling on the workbench, taking measure of the operation, not the operator. "Open," Evelyn confirmed, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. "What do you need?" "Horse threw a shoe about 5 miles back. Need a replacement." He gestured to the buckskin. "Can you check the others while you're at it? We've come a long way, and we've got further yet to go." "We." He spoke about the horse like a partner, not a possession. Evelyn filed that detail away. A man who thought of his animal as a companion was usually a man worth knowing, or at least a man worth working for. "Bring him in." She moved to clear space near the forge, pulling her farrier tools within reach. "I'll need to see the hoof. Check for damage." The stranger led his horse forward with a practiced hand, murmuring something too low for Evelyn to catch. The buckskin's ears swiveled toward him, then forward toward Evelyn with alert but calm interest. A well-trained animal. Well cared for. Evelyn approached slowly, letting the horse catch her scent. She'd learned from her father that animals sensed intention more clearly than people did. Horses especially. They didn't care about town gossip or social propriety. They only cared whether you were competent and whether you meant harm. "Easy," she murmured, running her hand along the buckskin's shoulder. The muscle beneath was solid, well-maintained. This was a working horse, not some gentleman's riding mount kept soft in a stable. "Let's see what you've done to yourself." She lifted the hoof, examining it with hands that knew exactly what to look for. The frog looked healthy, no signs of thrush or injury. The horse had simply worn through the shoe, probably hit a rock at the wrong angle, and sheared the nails clean through on one side. "No damage," she announced, setting the hoof down gently. "Clean loss. You're lucky. Another mile and he might have bruised the sole." "That's what I was afraid of." The stranger's voice held relief. "How long for a replacement?" Evelyn calculated quickly. The forge was already hot, she had blanks ready, and the work itself was straightforward. "Hour, maybe less if the fitting goes smooth." "Appreciate it." He started to lead the horse toward the hitching post, then paused. "Name's Caleb Rowe." Protocol dictated she give her full name in return, but Evelyn had learned that introducing herself as Miss Hart invited a particular kind of attention. the kind that tried to determine why she was still Miss at her age and what deficiency explained it. Better to keep it simple. Hart, she said, the forge is Hart's forge. Something flickered in his expression, recognition maybe that she'd declined to provide more than necessary. But he didn't push, just nodded and secured his horse, then settled onto the bench her father had built along the forge's front wall. Most customers left. They'd drop off their work and return later, conducting the transaction with minimal contact, as if proximity to Evelyn's occupation might somehow transfer to them. The fact that Caleb Rowe chose to stay shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Evelyn selected a blank and thrust it into the coals, working the bellows until the metal began to glow. The familiar rhythm settled over her: heat, hammer, shape, test, repeat. The world narrowed to fire and iron and the ringing percussion that had become the soundtrack of her life. She was dimly aware of Caleb watching, but it didn't carry the weight she'd learned to dread. He wasn't staring. He was observing, the way someone might watch any skilled craftsperson work. When she glanced his way, checking the angle of the morning light, she told herself, she caught him nodding slightly, as if she'd done something that confirmed his assessment. The horseshoe took shape. She worked methodically, testing the fit twice before she was satisfied, then set it aside to cool while she checked the buckskin's other shoes. All solid, but the right hind was wearing thin. This one won't last another week on rough ground, she told Caleb, indicating the worn shoe. Want me to replace it while you're here? He came over to look, crouching beside her as she held the hoof. This close, she could smell trail dust and leather, could see the weathering around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into distances. Can't afford to today, he admitted, straightforward about it. Just came into town for work. Haven't got the pay yet. Most people trying to establish credit would have dressed it up, made elaborate promises, perhaps mentioned family connections or their general reliability. His honesty was startling in its simplicity. Tell you what, Evelyn heard herself say, I'll do the hind shoe at cost if you can pay when you get work. But if you're planning to leave town before then, better speak now. Just got hired at Broken Creek Ranch. Start tomorrow. I'll be around. He met her eyes directly. I pay my debts, Miss Hart. The title startled her. She'd said just Hart, but he'd filled in the courtesy without making it feel like an assumption or an insult. Just a simple acknowledgement of respect. Fair enough. She released the horse's hoof and stood. I'll have both done within 2 hours. Obliged. Caleb returned to the bench, pulling a whetstone from his pocket and beginning to sharpen his knife with long, practiced strokes. Evelyn returned to work, heating the second blank. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air beyond the forge's already considerable heat. Sweat soaked through her shirt, plastering it to her back, tracing paths down her temples. She ignored it, the way she ignored the faint sounds of the town waking up around them, the general store opening across the square, the church bell marking the hour, the voices of women greeting each other on their morning errands. She was shaping the second shoe when she heard the voices grow closer. Female voices pitched at that particular frequency that meant gossip being exchanged. Shocking, really, that she continues this way. My Henry says it's not natural, a woman doing such work. Mrs. Henderson. Evelyn's shoulders tightened involuntarily. Well, what choice does she have? It's not as if anyone's going to marry her looking like that. Those arms... This was Alice Morrison, whose husband ran the livery stable. Her voice dropped to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried better than normal speech. I heard she can lift an anvil. Can you imagine? Evelyn could, in fact, lift an anvil. She'd done it last month when she needed to move it closer to the forge. But the horror in Alice Morrison's tone suggested she was describing something obscene rather than a practical demonstration of strength. Pride comes before a fall, Mrs. Henderson announced with the satisfaction of someone quoting scripture in service of judgment. Mark my words, she'll end up alone in that forge, growing old without family or prospects. A woman needs to know her place. The hammer in Evelyn's hand seemed heavier suddenly. Each ring of steel on steel felt like an announcement of everything that made her unacceptable. Too strong. Too independent. Too visible. Too much. She didn't look toward the street, didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing she'd heard. But her jaw tightened, and the next hammer blow landed harder than necessary, sending sparks scattering like accusations. From the corner of her eye, she saw Caleb Rowe look up from his knife sharpening, saw him glance toward the street where the women's voices were fading, then back to her. His expression was unreadable, but he'd gone still in a way that suggested he'd heard every word. The hot coal of shame burned in Evelyn's chest. It didn't matter that she'd heard worse. It didn't matter that she'd developed defenses against this particular brand of cruelty. Something about having it happen in front of Caleb Rowe, this stranger who'd treated her with simple respect, made it sting fresh. She kept working, jaw set, refusing to acknowledge the moment. The horseshoe took shape beneath her hammer. She tested the fit, adjusted, tested again. Perfect. She set it aside to cool, then started on the final shoe. The silence stretched. Not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with things unsaid. "You're good at that." Caleb's voice cut across the hammer's rhythm. Evelyn paused, looking over at him. "At what?" "The work." He gestured toward the cooling horseshoes. "Clean lines, even heating. You've got a steady hand and an eye for detail. It's good work." It was the simplest compliment imaginable, but something in Evelyn's chest cracked slightly, like ice under the first thaw. "My father taught me," she said, the words coming out rougher than intended. "He was the best smith in 3 counties." "He taught you well." Caleb resumed his knife sharpening, the whetstone singing its own quiet rhythm. "Though I suspect talent runs deeper than teaching. Some people have a feel for the craft, you can always tell." Evelyn didn't know what to do with this, with praise that didn't come wrapped in surprise or qualification, praise that didn't begin with despite or even though or for a woman, just straightforward recognition of skill. She returned to work, but something had shifted. The remaining horseshoe seemed to shape itself beneath her hands, the metal yielding to her vision with unusual ease. Or perhaps it was just that the weight in her chest had lightened fractionally, allowing her to breathe deeper, work smoother. When she finished, she fitted all 4 shoes to the buckskin's hooves with meticulous care. The horse stood patient and calm, sensing her competence. Animals always knew. They didn't care about town gossip or proper feminine behavior. They only cared whether you were good at your job. "All done," she announced, straightening and pressing one hand to the small of her back. "He's ready for whatever trail you're pointing him toward." Caleb examined her work, lifting each hoof to check the fit and the nail placement. His inspection was thorough but not suspicious, the examination of someone who knew horses and wanted to see the work done right. "Perfect," he said finally, setting down the last hoof. "What do I owe you for today's shoe?" Evelyn quoted her standard rate, fair but not cheap. She'd learned early that undercharging only invited people to undervalue her work. Caleb counted out the coins without hesitation, then paused. "And the second shoe? When should I come back to settle that?" "End of your first week," Evelyn suggested. "Ranch work pays weekly, usually." "Friday, then." He gathered his reins, preparing to mount. Then he paused, one boot in the stirrup, and looked back at her. "I appreciate you trusting me for the second shoe. Not many folks extend credit to strangers." "You didn't seem like the type to run off owing money to a woman who knows where you work and could ruin your reputation with your new employer," Evelyn said dryly. Something lit in his eyes. Amusement, she thought. "Practical. I like that." He swung into the saddle with the easy grace of someone who'd spent half his life on horseback. The buckskin shifted beneath him, eager to move after standing still so long. "One more thing," Caleb said, looking down at her from the saddle. Evelyn waited, braced for something that would spoil the morning, some awkward comment about her situation, or unwanted advice, or pity dressed up as concern. "Strong looks beautiful on you." He said it simply, matter-of-factly, the way he might comment on the weather or the quality of her horseshoes. Then he touched his hat brim and guided his horse toward the road before Evelyn could formulate a response. She stood in her forge yard, staring after him, her mind completely blank. "Strong looks beautiful on you, not despite your strength, or even though you're strong, or any of the tortured qualifications men usually employed when they wanted to seem progressive while still expressing discomfort with her physicality. Just a straightforward statement that strength and beauty could coexist, that they could be the same thing. The hot coal in her chest, the one that had burned there since Mrs. Henderson's comments, since Alice Morrison's horrified whisper about lifting anvils, since 100 other moments of judgment, suddenly felt less like shame and more like something else. Something that might, with enough air, become warmth instead of pain. Evelyn turned back to her forge, where the fire still glowed and the next day's work waited. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, the weight of the town's judgment felt fractionally lighter. She didn't let herself think about why that might be. Didn't let herself examine the flutter that had risen in her stomach when Caleb Rowe looked at her like strength was something to admire rather than excuse. That way led to hope, and hope was more dangerous than any amount of iron heated beyond its tolerance. Instead, she did what she always did. She stoked the fire and reached for her hammer, and let the work speak for itself. The days that followed established a rhythm. Evelyn rose before dawn, lit the forge, and worked through the morning's standing orders. Thomas Wright collected his mare's shoe without comment, leaving payment on the workbench rather than handing it to her directly. The Jacobson brothers sent their youngest boy to fetch their finished horseshoes, the child staring at Evelyn with wide eyes as if she were a curious specimen in a traveling show. She filled the hours with labor, fixing a broken wagon axle for the Miller family, crafting new hinges for the church door, ordered through Reverend Matthews, who seemed perpetually embarrassed to be conducting business with her, reshaping a bent plow blade. The work was steady, if not abundant, enough to keep the forge running, enough to keep her fed and sheltered, not enough to stop the whispers. On Tuesday, she made the mistake of shopping for supplies during the midday hour when the general store was full. She'd needed to. Her leather stores were running low, and she couldn't put off the purchase any longer. But walking into that space, feeling the conversation halt like a door slamming shut, cost her more than the leather did. Mrs. Henderson was there, of course. She seemed to have a supernatural ability to materialize whenever Evelyn ventured into public spaces. "Miss Hart," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "How unusual to see you away from your establishment." Evelyn kept her eyes on the merchant behind the counter. "Need leather for aprons, the heavyweight kind." "Of course you do." Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested Evelyn had just confirmed some private theory. Such rough work must go through materials terribly fast. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it, with that particular emphasis that turned rough work into something vulgar. Evelyn paid for her leather and left, her face burning. She made it halfway back to the forge before she had to stop, pressing one hand against the wall of the hardware store, breathing through the familiar shame rage that came from being made to feel grotesque simply for existing. "You let them get to you, they win," her father's voice echoing from memory. He'd told her that the first time she came home crying after the other children mocked her for choosing to work in the forge instead of learning embroidery with their mothers. "I know," she whispered to the empty air. "I know." But knowing and feeling were different countries, and the border between them was written in other people's judgment. She straightened, squared her shoulders, and walked the remaining distance to her forge with her head up. Let them watch. Let them whisper. She'd be here tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, doing work they needed even as they despised her for doing it. Friday arrived like a promise she was afraid to acknowledge. Evelyn told herself she wasn't waiting for Caleb Rowe. Told herself she was simply working through her regular tasks, repairing fence wire for the Patterson Ranch, sharpening a collection of kitchen knives for the restaurant, fashioning a new fire poker for Mrs. Chen, the only woman in town who seemed genuinely unconcerned about Evelyn's occupation. But she'd washed her face 3 times that morning, and she'd changed her shirt when the first one got too stained with soot, and she'd caught herself glancing toward the road more often than the work required. He arrived in the late afternoon when the light turned golden and the day's heat was just beginning to ease. The buckskin looked well-fed and rested. Ranch work was clearly suiting them both. "Came to settle my account," Caleb announced, dismounting with that same easy grace she remembered. "And check your horse's shoes?" Evelyn suggested, surprising herself with the hint of teasing in her voice. "That too." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and created lines around them. "Though I'd trust your work even without checking." Evelyn examined all 4 shoes anyway, more because it gave her something to do with her hands than because she doubted her work. Everything held solid, exactly as she'd known it would. "They're good," she confirmed. Should last another few months at least, depending on what terrain you're covering. Mostly valley work right now, checking fence lines, moving cattle between pastures. He counted out coins for the second shoe, then added an extra. For the careful work. Evelyn started to protest the tip, then stopped. She'd learned to accept payment gracefully, even when pride wanted her to refuse anything that smelled of charity. This wasn't charity, though. This was appreciation for craftsmanship. "Thank you," she said simply, pocketing the coins. Caleb didn't remount immediately. Instead, he seemed to be weighing something, his gaze moving from the forge to the tools to Evelyn herself. "Can I ask you something?" Wariness rose instantly. In Evelyn's experience, "can I ask you something" usually preceded either an insultingly personal question or unwanted advice about her life choices. "You can ask," she said carefully. "Can't promise I'll answer." "Fair enough." He shifted his weight, and she realized he was actually nervous. The discovery was oddly humanizing. "How long have you been running this forge alone?" 18 months, since my father died. "And before that, you worked with him?" "Since I was old enough to hold a hammer." She didn't mention that she'd started learning at 10, or that her father had begun teaching her in earnest when it became clear she had both the talent and the temperament for the work. Those details felt too intimate for a transaction on a Friday afternoon. Caleb nodded slowly, as if confirming something. "The reason I ask is, well, Broken Creek Ranch has its own small forge, mostly for emergency repairs, quick fixes. The foreman handles it, but he's getting old and his hands aren't what they used to be. He mentioned they might need to contract some of the heavier work out." Evelyn's heart kicked against her ribs. Contract work from one of the largest ranches in the territory could transform her business from precarious survival to genuine stability. "I could handle that," she said, trying to keep the desperate hope from her voice. "I figured." Caleb met her eyes. "I could mention you to him, if you want. Let him know there's a skilled blacksmith in town who does quality work." "Why would you do that?" The question came out more suspicious than she intended, but she'd learned wariness through hard experience. Help usually came with hooks embedded in it. Caleb looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Because I've seen your work, and it's good. And because Wade, that's the foreman, is practical. He cares about whether the job gets done right, not about—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Not about anything else. Not about whether the blacksmith was a woman, not about town gossip or social propriety, just about competence." "I'd appreciate that," Evelyn said quietly. "More than I can say." "Consider it done, then." Caleb gathered his reins. "I'll let you know what he says." He started to mount, then paused again, that same hesitation she'd noticed before, as if he was working up to something. "There's a barn raising next Saturday at the Hutchinson place," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Whole community's invited. There'll be food after, some music probably. Would you—" He stopped, started again. "I'd be glad of your company, if you wanted to come." The world tilted slightly. It wasn't a formal courtship request. Barn raisings were community events, and his invitation was casual enough to allow for retreat. But it was still an invitation, still a public acknowledgement that he wanted her presence. Every instinct Evelyn had developed over the past 18 months screamed at her to refuse. Public events meant public judgment, meant being watched and evaluated and found wanting, meant exposing herself to the collective assessment of a community that had already decided she didn't fit. But another part of her, smaller, more fragile but insistent, whispered that Caleb Rowe had looked at her like strength was beautiful, had sought out her company, had offered to help her business without asking for anything in return. "I'll think about it," she heard herself say. It wasn't yes, but it wasn't no either. Caleb's face brightened. "That's all I'm asking. Let me know before Saturday?" "I will." He touched his hat brim and rode off, leaving Evelyn standing in her forge yard, her mind spinning. A barn raising, with Caleb Rowe, in front of the entire community. The thought terrified her, but it also, and this was the dangerous part, it also sparked something that felt dangerously like hope. What? Saturday came whether Evelyn was ready or not. She'd spent the week in an agony of indecision, her mind swinging between yes and no like a pendulum that couldn't find rest. Every argument for going came with a counter-argument for staying. Every moment of hope was answered by a memory of humiliation. Caleb had stopped by Wednesday with word from Wade, the Broken Creek foreman. They wanted her to come out to the ranch Monday morning to discuss contract work. The practical part of Evelyn's mind knew this was important, possibly the most important business opportunity she'd had since her father's death. But all she could think about was the barn raising, and whether accepting Caleb's invitation would jinx the ranch opportunity before it even started. Thursday, Mrs. Chen came to collect her fire poker and stayed for tea, the way she did sometimes. The older woman had emigrated from China 20 years ago and had her own experience with being the subject of town gossip. She understood margins in a way the properly settled women never would. "You are thinking too much," Mrs. Chen announced, setting down her teacup with a decisive click. "This man, he sees you clearly. That is rare. You should let him continue to see you." "And if he sees too clearly?" Evelyn had asked. "If he decides, I'm not worth the trouble?" "Then he is not the man you think he is, and you learn this now instead of later. But hiding yourself to avoid rejection, that is rejecting yourself before he gets the chance. Very foolish." Evelyn had laughed despite herself, and Mrs. Chen had smiled her small, knowing smile and changed the subject to the price of rice at the general store. But the words stayed with her. "You are rejecting yourself before he gets the chance." Friday night, Evelyn stood in front of her small mirror, examining herself with brutal honesty. The woman looking back was undeniably strong, shoulders broad from years of hammer work, forearms corded with muscle, hands calloused and scarred from hot metal and rough labor. Her face was pleasant enough, she supposed, though currently smudged with soot she'd somehow missed. Dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. Brown eyes that had learned to guard themselves. Not beautiful, by the town's standards. Not soft or delicate, or any of the things women were supposed to be. But Caleb had said strong looked beautiful on her. Had said it like he meant it, like it was simply a fact rather than a consolation. What if he was right? Saturday morning dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for a barn raising. Evelyn woke before sunrise, her stomach in knots. She had to decide. Today was the day. She could stay home, safe in her forge, where the only judgment came from whether the metal heated evenly and the horseshoes fit true. Could send word to Caleb that she wasn't feeling well, or that work had piled up, or any of a dozen excuses that would let her avoid the risk. Or she could go. Could walk into a community gathering on the arm of a man who seemed to genuinely want her there. Could face the whispers and the stares, and all the small cruelties that came with visibility. Could choose herself instead of rejecting herself first. Evelyn stood in her small cabin, feeling the weight of the decision like physical pressure. Through the window, she could see the forge, familiar and safe. Could see the life she'd built alone, precarious but hers. And for the first time since her father died, she let herself wonder if alone was the same as strong, or if maybe, just maybe, strength could include letting someone else see you clearly. The hot coal that had burned in her chest for 18 months flickered, transformed for a moment into something that felt like courage. She pulled her one good dress from the trunk at the foot of her bed. Simple calico in deep blue. The sleeves shorter than fashion dictated because she'd never been able to find one that fit her arms properly. She'd stopped wearing it months ago, tired of the way it announced her difference. But today she put it on. Let the fabric settle over her strong shoulders and powerful arms. Didn't try to hide what she was. She braided her hair carefully, washed her face until no trace of soot remained, and looked at herself one more time in the mirror. The woman looking back was still strong, still unmistakably herself. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Evelyn locked her cabin door and began walking toward the Hutchinson place, where the sound of hammers and voices was already rising into the morning air. With each step, she felt the familiar weight of the town's judgment waiting for her. But she also felt something else, something fragile and new and terrifyingly hopeful. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry that weight alone. The Hutchinson place sat 2 miles outside town, where the valley opened up and the mountains made a frame against the sky. By the time Evelyn arrived, the yard was already crowded with wagons and horses, the air filled with the sounds of men calling instructions to each other and the steady percussion of hammers on wood. Women clustered near the house, arranging food on long tables, their bright dresses like flowers against the weathered boards. Evelyn felt every eye turn toward her the moment she stepped into the clearing. The conversations didn't stop exactly, but they stuttered, lowered in volume, took on that particular quality that meant she'd become the subject rather than the audience. She recognized the pattern, had lived it 100 times before. What she wasn't prepared for was how much worse it felt when she'd actually chosen to be here, when she'd actively walked into the judgment instead of simply enduring it as a byproduct of necessary errands. Her first instinct was to turn around, to retreat back down the road to the safety of her forge. But then she saw Caleb. He was up on the barn frame with 3 other men, fitting a beam into place. His shirt was already dark with sweat, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms nearly as muscled as her own. He must have sensed her arrival because he looked down, and the smile that spread across his face was so genuine, so uncomplicated by anything except pleasure at seeing her, that Evelyn felt something in her chest unlock. He said something to the men beside him, then climbed down the frame with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent half his life working at heights. By the time he reached the ground, Evelyn had made it halfway across the yard, navigating the gauntlet of stairs with her chin up and her shoulders back. "You came," Caleb said, and there was such relief in his voice that Evelyn wondered if he doubted she would. "I said I'd think about it," she reminded him. "Apparently I thought yes." His smile widened. "Best news I've had all week." He glanced toward the barn frame. "I'm on beam placement for another hour or so, but after that, would you take a walk with me? There's a creek on the far side of the property. It's cooler there." "I'd like that." The words felt dangerous leaving her mouth, like admitting to something that couldn't be taken back. But Caleb's expression suggested he understood the weight of them, the choice they represented. "Good," he said quietly. Then, louder. "In the meantime, I should get back up there before Frank decides I'm shirking. But I'm glad you're here, Evelyn." It was the first time he'd used her given name, the sound of it in his voice, warm, certain, completely free of the judgment she'd learned to anticipate, made her throat tight. "I'm glad too," she managed. He touched her arm briefly, a gesture so fleeting she might have imagined it, then headed back to the barn frame. Evelyn stood in the middle of the yard, suddenly uncertain what to do with herself. At barn raisings, men worked on the structure while women handled food preparation and childcare. The division was absolute, expected, and left no room for someone like her, too strong for the kitchen, too female for the frame. She was considering whether she could slip away unnoticed for the next hour when a voice called out behind her. "Evelyn Hart, as I live and breathe." She turned to find Sarah Hutchinson approaching, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. Sarah had been 2 years ahead of Evelyn in school, one of the few girls who'd never actively participated in the teasing. Not friendly exactly, but not cruel either. They'd existed in separate orbits, their lives touching only at the necessary points. "Sarah," Evelyn said carefully, "congratulations on the new barn." "Thank you, though I'll be more congratulated when it's actually standing." Sarah's eyes were curious but not unkind. "I didn't expect to see you here. You don't usually come to these things." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Evelyn appreciated the neutrality even as she struggled with how to respond. "I was invited," she said finally. "By Caleb Rowe?" Sarah's eyebrows rose. "The new hand at Broken Creek?" Word traveled fast in small towns. Evelyn should have known there'd be no privacy about this, no way to explore whatever was happening between her and Caleb without it becoming community property. "Yes," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "By Caleb." Sarah studied her for a long moment, and Evelyn braced for the judgment, the speculation, the thinly veiled suggestion that she should be grateful any man showed interest. Instead, Sarah smiled. "Well then, welcome. Though I have to warn you, Mrs. Henderson is in the kitchen, and she's already been asking pointed questions about why the blacksmith is here. Fair warning." "Appreciated." "Come on," Sarah said, gesturing toward the tables. "Make yourself useful with the lemonade. At least that way you'll look busy when the gossip mill starts grinding." It was the kindest offer Evelyn had received in months. She followed Sarah to the beverage station where enormous pitchers of lemonade sat waiting to be distributed. The work was simple: pour, serve, repeat. but it gave her hands something to do and a reason to stand apart from the main cluster of women. She'd just finished filling her fifth cup when Mrs. Henderson materialized beside her, like a storm cloud that had found its target. "Miss Hart," she said, her voice sugary with false warmth. "What a surprise to see you at a social gathering. I would have thought you'd be busy at your forge." She said forge, the way other people might say brothel. "The forge can wait a day," Evelyn replied evenly. "Seemed like the community could use all the help they could get." "Oh, but surely you'd be more useful up on the frame with the men." Mrs. Henderson's smile sharpened. "Given your particular talents." The insult was carefully crafted, suggesting Evelyn was too masculine for feminine company, while simultaneously implying she was overstepping by even considering joining the men's work. A double bind designed to make her feel wrong, no matter what choice she made. Evelyn felt the familiar heat rising in her cheeks, the hot coal of shame settling in her chest. But before she could formulate a response, another voice cut in. "Mrs. Henderson, how kind of you to recognize skill when you see it." Mrs. Chen appeared on Evelyn's other side, her tone pleasant but her eyes sharp. "Though I think the lemonade station benefits more from Evelyn's careful attention. The last time you poured, didn't 3 people complain it was too sour?" Mrs. Henderson's face flushed. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "I'm sure you don't." Mrs. Chen smiled blandly. "Perhaps you should check on the pies. I believe someone said the crusts were burning." It was a dismissal so smooth that Mrs. Henderson couldn't protest without appearing difficult. She huffed once, then swept away toward the house, her skirt snapping with indignation. "Thank you," Evelyn said quietly. Mrs. Chen shrugged. That woman has too much time and too little compassion. A dangerous combination. She picked up a pitcher of lemonade. "Come, we distribute drinks to the workers. Give you something to do besides stand here waiting to be insulted." They moved through the crowd together, offering cool drinks to the men who were taking brief breaks from the heavy work. Most accepted with barely a glance, too focused on the task at hand to care who was serving. But Evelyn noticed the double takes, the way some men's eyes would widen slightly when they realized who was handing them a cup. When they reached the barn frame, Caleb climbed down to accept his drink. His shirt was soaked through now, his hair damp with sweat, and there was sawdust caught in his stubble. He looked, Evelyn thought, like hard work personified. "Much obliged," he said, draining half the cup in one long swallow. "It's hot up there." "I can imagine." Evelyn refilled his cup from her pitcher. "How's the work coming?" "Good. Another hour and we'll have the frame complete. Then it's just roof beams and we're done with the heavy lifting." He glanced toward where Mrs. Chen had moved on to serve other workers. "I saw Mrs. Henderson corner you earlier. She give you trouble?" "Nothing I can't handle." "I don't doubt that." Caleb's expression turned serious. "But you shouldn't have to handle it alone. If anyone gives you grief while you're here with me, I've been handling it long before you arrived in K-Fax," Evelyn interrupted gently. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not fragile." "Never thought you were." He finished the second cup and handed it back to her, their fingers brushing briefly. "But there's a difference between being strong and having to be strong all the time. Sometimes it's okay to let someone else carry part of it." The words settled into Evelyn like seeds finding soil. She didn't know what to do with them, how to reconcile the independence she'd built like armor with the possibility that armor might sometimes be set aside safely. "I'll remember that," she said finally. Caleb smiled. "Good. Now I'd better get back up there before Frank accuses me of malingering." He paused. "Still want to take that walk later?" "Still do." "Then I'll find you when we break for supper." He climbed back up the frame, and Evelyn continued her rounds with the lemonade, feeling strangely lighter despite the continued stares and whispers that followed her through the crowd. The afternoon wore on. The barn frame took shape piece by piece, each beam fitted and secured with the kind of communal effort that made small-town life possible. Evelyn found herself falling into the rhythm of the gathering, refilling pitchers, carrying empty plates back to the kitchen, even holding a board steady while one of the older men cut it to length. No one asked her to do this last task. She simply saw the need and stepped in, and the old man, Jacob something, she couldn't remember his last name, had grunted his thanks and made the cut without comment on her gender or her strength or anything else. It was, Evelyn realized with something like surprise, almost pleasant, not comfortable. She was too aware of the watching eyes, the whispered conversations that stopped when she drew near. But bearable. More than bearable, even, because every time she glanced toward the barn frame, she could see Caleb working, and occasionally he'd look down and catch her eye and smile like they shared a secret. Maybe they did. Maybe the secret was just that he saw her clearly and hadn't run. By late afternoon, the barn frame stood complete, its skeleton stark against the sky. The men climbed down, congratulating each other and inspecting their work with the satisfaction of a job well done. Someone produced a fiddle, and a few of the younger children started dancing in the yard, their laughter bright against the adult conversation. Caleb found Evelyn near the lemonade station, where she'd returned after her last round of serving. "Ready for that walk?" he asked. She was. More than ready. The crowd was pressing in on her, and the weight of being watched was starting to feel like physical pressure. But walking off alone with Caleb would make a statement, would give the gossips more ammunition, would transform this from the blacksmith attended a barn raising to the blacksmith is being courted by the new ranch hand. Evelyn looked at Caleb, at his open expression and his patient waiting, and made her choice. "Lead the way," she said. They walked across the yard together, and if the conversations died down as they passed, if Mrs. Henderson's eyes followed them with sharp interest, Evelyn chose not to notice. She kept her eyes forward and her stride steady, and when Caleb's hand brushed against hers, she didn't pull away. The path to the creek wound through a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves rustling in the late afternoon breeze. The sounds of the gathering faded behind them, replaced by birdsong and the distant murmur of running water. The air was cooler here, shaded by the trees, and Evelyn felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders. "I used to come to places like this when I was traveling," Caleb said as they walked. "Find a creek or a river, somewhere quiet. Help settle the mind after too much people." "You travel a lot?" Evelyn asked. "Used to. Worked ranches all over, Nevada, Wyoming, down into New Mexico. Never stayed anywhere long." He ducked under a low branch, holding it back so it wouldn't swing into Evelyn. "Started to feel like I was running from something instead of running toward anything. That's why I took the job at Broken Creek. Figured it was time to see what staying put felt like." They emerged at the creek, which ran clear and quick over smooth stones. Caleb led her to a fallen log that made a natural bench, and they sat side by side, watching the water flow. "What about you?" Caleb asked. "Ever think about leaving K-Fax?" Evelyn considered the question. "Sometimes. Especially after my father died. When it got—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Harder. I thought about selling the forge, moving somewhere no one knew me. Starting fresh." "What stopped you?" "Pride, mostly." She picked up a small stone and turned it over in her fingers. "The forge was my father's legacy. Selling it would have felt like admitting they were right, that I couldn't do it, that I didn't belong. And I was angry enough that I wanted to prove them wrong more than I wanted to be comfortable." "Anger's a powerful fuel," Caleb observed. "It is, but it's a lonely one, too." Evelyn threw the stone into the creek, watching the ripples spread. "You burn it long enough, there's nothing left but ash." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of quiet that felt comfortable rather than awkward. A dragonfly skimmed the water's surface. Somewhere downstream, a bird called out and received an answer. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said finally. Evelyn braced herself. "Seems to be your habit." He smiled at that. "Fair. But this one's important." He shifted on the log to face her more directly. "Why did you really come today? I know I invited you, but you could have said no. Could have made an excuse. What changed your mind?" It was the kind of question that demanded honesty, that wouldn't accept polite deflection. Evelyn found herself answering before she'd fully decided to. "I was tired," she said quietly. "Tired of being alone. Tired of acting like I didn't care what they thought when it still hurt every single time. Tired of rejecting myself before anyone else got the chance." She met his eyes. "And you looked at me like strength was beautiful, and I wanted to see if maybe you were right." Caleb's expression softened. "I am right, and I can prove it." "How?" "By continuing to look at you exactly that way until you start believing it yourself." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull back, and took her hand. His palm was calloused from rope and reins, warm and solid against hers. Evelyn, I know we've barely known each other 2 weeks. I know this is fast. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the first time I saw you in that forge, completely focused on your work, strong and skilled and beautiful. Her throat tightened. People will talk. Let them. It won't be kind talk. They'll say you're desperate or strange or that you don't know better. I don't care what they say. His grip on her hand tightened slightly. I care what you say. I care whether you might be willing to let me court you properly, to see if this, he gestured between them, if this might be something worth building. Evelyn felt like she was standing on the edge of something vast. One step forward and everything would change. Her careful isolation, her protective armor, her determination to need no one, all of it would crack open, leaving her vulnerable to a kind of hurt she'd spent 18 months avoiding. But she'd also be vulnerable to something else, something that felt like hope wearing a human face. I'm not easy, she heard herself say. I'm set in my ways. I like my work and I won't give it up. I'm too independent and too stubborn, and probably half a dozen other things that will drive you crazy. I'm counting on it, Caleb said, and his smile was so warm, so certain that Evelyn felt the last of her resistance crumble. Then, yes, she whispered. Yes, you can court me, if you're sure. I've never been more sure of anything. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, those scarred, calloused knuckles that had hammered 1,000 horseshoes, that bore the permanent marks of her trade. The gesture was so tender, so completely accepting of everything she was, that Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. Don't, Caleb said softly, noticing. Don't cry. I'm not crying, but her voice broke on the words, giving her away. I didn't think this was possible. Didn't think anyone would want a woman who's strong and capable and honest, who doesn't pretend to be something she's not? Caleb shook his head. Then you've been talking to the wrong people. They sat together by the creek as the light turned golden, as the shadows lengthened and the air cooled. Caleb told her about his travels, about the places he'd seen and the work he'd done. Evelyn told him about learning the forge from her father, about the satisfaction of transforming raw metal into something useful, about the loneliness of the past 18 months. It felt like excavation, carefully uncovering layers they'd both kept hidden. Not confessing exactly, but revealing, choosing to be seen. When they finally stood to head back, Caleb kept hold of her hand. Evelyn let him, though she knew what it would mean when they emerged from the trees still linked together. Let the town talk. Let Mrs. Henderson speculate. For once, she had something worth being talked about. The gathering had shifted into evening mode by the time they returned. The food tables were laden with covered dishes, and someone had lit lanterns as the sun dropped toward the mountains. Families clustered together, eating and talking, while children chased each other between the wagons. The moment Evelyn and Caleb stepped into the clearing, still holding hands, she felt the attention shift toward them like a physical force. Conversations paused. Eyes tracked their movement across the yard. She saw Mrs. Henderson lean toward Alice Morrison, whispering something that made both women's faces pinch with disapproval. Evelyn's first instinct was to drop Caleb's hand, to create distance, to protect herself from the judgment she knew was coming. But then she felt Caleb's thumb brush across her knuckles, a small gesture of reassurance, and she kept her grip firm. They filled plates from the communal tables and found a spot to sit slightly apart from the main clusters. Other men from Broken Creek Ranch drifted over. Frank, who'd been working beside Caleb on the barn frame, and 2 younger hands named Pete and Marcus. They acknowledged Evelyn with nods, then launched into a good-natured argument about the best way to string fence wire. It should have been awkward. Evelyn sitting among working men, clearly being courted by one of them, her presence a disruption of the usual social order. But Frank treated her like any other person. Marcus asked her opinion on iron quality for fence posts, a question she could actually answer with authority. And Pete told a rambling story about a horse that ended with everyone laughing, including Evelyn. She caught Caleb watching her during the laughter, his expression soft and pleased, like he'd given her a gift and was happy to see her enjoying it. Maybe he had. Maybe the gift was just this, being included, being treated like her presence mattered, being seen as someone worth talking to rather than someone to whisper about. As full darkness fell, someone started playing the fiddle in earnest, and couples began to dance in the cleared space near the barn. It was informal, spontaneous, nothing like the structured dances at church socials. Just people moving to music, celebrating the completion of hard work. Caleb stood and offered Evelyn his hand. "Dance with me?" Every eye in the clearing seemed to turn toward them. Evelyn saw Mrs. Henderson's scandalized expression, saw Sarah Hutchinson watching with open curiosity, saw a dozen other faces registering shock that the blacksmith was being invited to dance. The old Evelyn, the one who'd learned to make herself small, to avoid drawing attention, to protect herself through invisibility, would have refused, would have made some excuse about being tired or needing to head home. But this Evelyn, the one who'd chosen to come here, who'd walked by the creek holding Caleb's hand, who'd spent the evening being treated like she belonged, this Evelyn stood up. "I'm not a very good dancer," she warned. "Neither am I," Caleb said cheerfully. "We'll be terrible together." He led her into the cleared space, and they joined the other couples as the fiddler struck up a lively reel. Caleb was right. Neither of them was particularly skilled, but they were matched in their mediocrity, and there was something joyful about stumbling through the steps together, laughing when they got it wrong, apologizing when they stepped on each other's feet. Evelyn was so focused on the dance that she almost forgot about the watching crowd, almost forgot about the weight of judgment and expectation. For a few minutes, there was just the music and the movement, and Caleb's hand warm in hers. When the song ended, they were both breathless and grinning. The fiddler immediately launched into a slower tune, and Caleb pulled Evelyn closer for the kind of dance that required less footwork and more simple swaying. "Thank you," he said quietly, his mouth close to her ear. "For what? Stepping on your feet? For being here. For giving this a chance. For being brave enough to let them see us." Evelyn leaned back slightly to look at his face. In the lantern light, his features were warm and open, completely free of the calculation or agenda she'd learned to watch for. He meant it, all of it. "I'm still scared," she admitted. "That's okay. Being scared doesn't mean you're not brave, it just means the thing you're doing matters enough to scare you." They swayed together as the music played, and Evelyn let herself imagine it. A future where this wasn't a one-time act of courage, but a regular occurrence. Where she and Caleb might attend gatherings together, might be seen as a pair, might build something that existed outside her forge and his ranch work. The possibility felt both terrifying and essential, like standing at the edge of a cliff and discovering you had wings you'd never tested. When the song ended, they separated reluctantly. The evening was winding down, families gathering their children, loading empty dishes back into wagons, making ready for the journey home. Evelyn helped carry plates to the kitchen, receiving surprise thanks from Sarah Hutchinson and a grudging nod from Mrs. Henderson that might have been acknowledgement of her help. Caleb walked her to the edge of the property where the road back to town began. "I could walk you all the way home," he offered. "It's 2 miles out of your way, and you have work tomorrow." Evelyn gestured toward Broken Creek Ranch, which lay in the opposite direction. "I'll be fine." "I know you will be, but I'd like to anyway." In the end, they compromised, Caleb walking her halfway, to the point where the road split, one branch heading toward town and the other toward the ranch. They stood at the crossroads in the moonlight, neither quite ready to separate. "Tomorrow's Sunday," Caleb said. "I don't suppose you attend church?" Evelyn shook her head. "Stopped going after my father died. Reverend Matthews means well, but the congregation made it clear my presence made them uncomfortable. Apparently a woman blacksmith suggests dangerous ideas about women's roles." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Their loss. Maybe, but it means I have Sunday free." She hesitated, then took the leap. "If you wanted to visit the forge, see where I work when I'm not at barn raisings." His face lit up. "I'd like that. After lunch?" "After lunch." They stood looking at each other, the moment stretching into something significant. Then Caleb leaned in slowly, giving Evelyn every opportunity to step back, and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek. "Sleep well, Evelyn Hart." "You too, Caleb Rowe." She watched him walk away down the ranch road, his figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. Then she turned toward town, her heart light despite the long walk ahead. The streets of Kfax were quiet when she arrived, most households already settled for the night. But as she passed the boarding house, she saw a curtain twitch. Mrs. Pritchard, keeping her eternal vigil, bearing witness to Evelyn's late return. Let her watch. Let her report to Mrs. Henderson tomorrow that the blacksmith came home late from the barn raising, smiling like she had a secret. Let them all speculate and whisper and draw their conclusions. For the first time in 18 months, Evelyn didn't care. She had something they couldn't diminish with their talk. She had someone who saw her clearly and hadn't looked away. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Evelyn replayed the day. The weight of walking into the gathering, Mrs. Chen's defense, the cool shade by the creek and Caleb's hand in hers, the dance under lantern light, the entire town watching, and the surprising discovery that being seen wasn't always the same as being judged. She thought about tomorrow, about Caleb visiting her forge, about crossing the threshold from public courtship to private revelation. The forge was her sanctuary, the one place she could be entirely herself without performance or apology. Inviting him into that space felt like the next step in the excavation they'd begun. Another layer of protection removed, another risk of being truly known. The thought should have terrified her, and part of it did. But a larger part, the part that had watched Caleb kiss her scarred knuckles like they were precious, felt something else entirely. It felt like hope. It felt like the possibility of building something that didn't require her to be smaller or softer or anything other than exactly what she was. It felt like the first real breath she'd taken since her father died. Outside, the night was quiet except for the distant bark of a dog and the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Kfax slept, unaware that something in its careful order had shifted, that the woman they'd written off as unmarriageable had been courted openly, had danced in lantern light, had let herself be seen choosing hope over isolation. Tomorrow, they'd talk about it. Mrs. Henderson would have opinions. Alice Morrison would express concern. The general store would buzz with speculation about the blacksmith and the ranch hand, about whether it would last, about what kind of man would want a woman like that. But for tonight, in the darkness of her small cabin, Evelyn let herself believe in the possibility Caleb represented. Let herself imagine a future where strength and love weren't opposites but complements, where she could keep her forge and her independence and still have someone to dance with under the stars. The hot coal that had burned in her chest for so long had transformed into something else, something warm and alive and dangerously close to joy. She fell asleep with Caleb's words echoing in her mind. Strong looks beautiful on you. Maybe it did. Maybe it always had. And she just needed someone to see it clearly enough to help her believe it herself. Sunday afternoon arrived with the kind of golden light that made everything look softer than it was. Evelyn had been awake since dawn, unable to sleep past the habit of early rising, and she'd spent the morning in a state of nervous energy that sent her cleaning the forge twice and rearranging her tools 3 times before she forced herself to stop. Caleb was coming to her sanctuary, to the place where she was most herself, most vulnerable, most exposed. The thought made her hands unsteady as she swept the floor for the 4th time, chasing dust that had already been banished hours ago. She'd just set the broom aside when she heard hoofbeats on the road. Her heart kicked against her ribs as she smoothed her apron and pushed a strand of hair behind her ear, then felt foolish for the gesture. This was her forge. If there was anywhere she didn't need to perform femininity, it was here. Caleb appeared in the doorway, and the smile that broke across his face when he saw her made Evelyn's breath catch. "Afternoon," he said, removing his hat. "Hope I'm not too early." "Right on time," she gestured around the space. "Welcome to Hart's Forge. It's not much, but it's mine." Caleb stepped inside, his gaze moving slowly across the organized chaos of her workspace. The forge itself, dark now, but still radiating residual heat from yesterday's work. The anvil, its face worn smooth by decades of hammer strikes. The tools arranged with careful precision on the walls, tongs and hammers and chisels and punches, each in its designated place. The workbench scattered with projects in various stages of completion. "It's perfect," he said quietly. "Exactly what I imagined." "You imagined my forge?" "Maybe once or twice." He moved closer to the anvil, running his hand along its edge with the reverence of someone who recognized quality craftsmanship. "This is beautiful. How old is it?" "My father bought it 30 years ago, when he first opened the forge. Saved for 2 years to afford it. Evelyn joined him beside the anvil, touching its surface with familiar affection. He used to say a good anvil was an investment in forever, that if you took care of it, it would outlive you and serve your children after. He was right. Caleb looked at her. Did he know you'd be the one to inherit it? I think so. Toward the end, anyway. Evelyn traced a small dent in the anvil's face, an imperfection that held memory. He made me promise I wouldn't sell, no matter how hard it got. Said the forge was proof that I didn't need anyone's permission to exist exactly as I was. Sounds like he was a wise man. He was. The grief that lived permanently in Evelyn's chest shifted, settling into the bittersweet ache of missing someone who'd truly understood her. I wish you could have met him. I think he would have liked you. Because I appreciate good metalwork? Because you don't think there's anything wrong with his daughter. The words came out more raw than she'd intended, exposing something she hadn't meant to reveal so quickly. But Caleb's expression didn't change, didn't register shock or discomfort at her vulnerability. There isn't anything wrong with you, he said simply. There never was. Evelyn had to look away, blinking against the sudden heat in her eyes. Want to see how it all works? She showed him everything over the next hour, explaining the process from raw iron to finished product. She lit the forge and demonstrated how the bellows controlled the heat, how the metal changed color as it heated, how you could read its readiness by sight and sound and even smell. She showed him how to hold the tongs, how to position the metal on the anvil, how each hammer served a different purpose. Caleb listened with complete attention, asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than polite performance. When she offered to let him try shaping a small piece of iron, he approached it with the seriousness of someone who understood he was being trusted with something important. His first hammer strike was tentative, barely denting the hot metal. Harder, Evelyn encouraged, moving to stand beside him. The metal can take it. Don't be afraid of your own strength. He swung again, and this time the impact rang true. The metal yielded slightly, beginning to take on the shape Evelyn had described. That's it, she said. Keep that rhythm. Heat, strike, turn, strike. Let the hammer do the work. They fell into a comfortable pattern, Evelyn coaching while Caleb worked. She found herself standing close to guide his movements, her hand on his arm to adjust his angle, her voice low as she explained the subtleties of the craft. The intimacy of it surprised her, this sharing of skill, this trust of her expertise, this comfortable proximity. After 20 minutes, Caleb had managed to create something that vaguely resembled the hook Evelyn had suggested. It was rough and uneven, clearly the work of a beginner, but it was recognizably functional. Not bad for a first attempt, Evelyn said, examining it critically. The curve is a little uneven, but the basic structure is sound. High praise from a master craftsman. Caleb set down the hammer, flexing his fingers. I have new respect for what you do. My arm's already tired. You build tolerance. When I first started, I could barely lift the 5-pound hammer for more than a few minutes. Now I can work it for hours. She plunged his practice hook into the water barrel, creating a hiss of steam. Though I won't lie, some days my shoulders ache so badly I can barely lift my arms to braid my hair. And the town thinks this isn't real work, Caleb said, his voice tight with anger on her behalf. The town thinks anything I do can't be real work, because I'm a woman doing it. If I were a man, this would be honest labor. Because I'm not. It's somehow... She searched for the right word. Unnatural. The only thing unnatural is their inability to see what's right in front of them. Evelyn set the cooled hook on her workbench, adding it to the collection of practice pieces that bore witness to her father's patient teaching. You want to know something? Sometimes I think they're right. Caleb turned to face her fully. Evelyn, not about the work, she clarified quickly. I know I'm good at this. I know my father taught me well, and I've earned every skill I have. But about the rest of it, about whether I'm wrong for wanting this life instead of the one they think I should have. She met his eyes. You're the first person in 18 months who's looked at me like I make sense. Everyone else looks at me like I'm a puzzle with missing pieces. And if they could just find the right words, I'd suddenly understand that I'm supposed to want something different. What do you want? Caleb asked quietly. It should have been a simple question, but Evelyn found herself standing at the edge of honesty, about to reveal things she'd barely admitted to herself. I want to keep this forge, she said slowly. I want to do work that matters, that I'm good at, that makes me feel competent and useful. I want to wake up every morning knowing I'm building something with my own hands. She paused, gathering courage. But I want what I saw last night at the barn raising, the dancing and the laughter and the sense of belonging somewhere. I want someone to come home to, someone who doesn't think I have to choose between being strong and being wanted. You don't have to choose, Caleb said. Evelyn, you don't have to choose. Don't I? She gestured toward the town beyond her forge walls. Look at what they think of me. Look at how they treat a woman who won't shrink herself down to acceptable size. If I marry, they'll expect me to sell this place, to become someone's wife instead of my own person. And if I don't marry, they'll pity me and whisper about how I died alone because I was too proud to know my place. So we prove them wrong, Caleb said. We build something they can't ignore or explain away. Something that shows them a woman can be strong and loved, independent and partnered, exactly herself and exactly what someone wants. The certainty in his voice was staggering. They'd known each other barely 3 weeks, and he was talking about building a future with the confidence of someone who'd already mapped the entire terrain. You make it sound simple, Evelyn whispered. It is simple. Not easy, but simple. He crossed the space between them, taking her soot-stained hands in his. I want to court you properly, Evelyn. I want to take you to town socials and walk with you on Sunday afternoons and let everyone see that I'm proud to be with you. I want to support your work, not supplant it. And eventually, if you'll have me, I want to marry you and build a life where you keep this forge and I keep working at Broken Creek and we prove to this whole damn town that their narrow vision of how life should look is just that. Narrow. Evelyn's throat had gone tight. They'll make it hard for you. Associating with me, courting me openly, there will be consequences. Let there be consequences. I've never cared much what people thought of me, and I'm not about to start now. His thumbs brushed across her knuckles, tracing the scars there. Besides, I've got something they don't. I've got you interested in me. That makes me the luckiest man in the territory. You're crazy, she said, but she was smiling. Probably. He smiled back. Is that a yes to proper courtship? I already said yes yesterday. I know, but that was by a creek in private. I wanted to hear you say it here, in your forge, where you're most yourself. Wanted to make sure you still meant it when you were standing in the middle of your own strength. The understanding in those words, the recognition that she might need different confirmations in different contexts, made Evelyn's heart turn over in her chest. Yes, she said clearly. I meant it yesterday, and I mean it today. Court me, Caleb Rowe. Let's see what we can build. He kissed her then, properly this time. Not the gentle brush of lips on her cheek, but a real kiss that tasted like promise and possibility. Evelyn kissed him back, her soot-stained hands finding their way to his shoulders, and for a moment the forge and the town and all her fears receded into irrelevance. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I should probably go, he said reluctantly. Before I forget every proper instinct I have. Probably wise. But Evelyn didn't step back, didn't release her hold on his shoulders. Though, before I do, there's something I wanted to ask you about. Caleb pulled back slightly, his expression turning serious. The harvest dance is in 3 weeks. It's the biggest social event of the season. Everyone in town attends, and people come in from the surrounding ranches, too. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She knew about the harvest dance. Everyone knew about the harvest dance. It was the night when the whole community gathered to celebrate the year's yield, to dance and eat and perform the elaborate rituals of small-town social hierarchy. It was also the last place Evelyn had attended as a young woman, 5 years ago, before her father got sick, before she'd taken over the forge full-time. Before she'd become the town's curiosity. She'd gone with Margaret Whitfield, her only real friend from school, both of them excited and nervous in their best dresses. But while Margaret had danced every dance, spinning through partners with laughing ease, Evelyn had stood against the wall and watched. No one had asked her to dance. No one had spoken to her except in pitying tones. And when Thomas Wright's younger brother had finally approached her, it had only been because his friends had dared him to ask the farm boy in a dress. She'd left early, walking home alone in the dark, and she'd never gone back. I know it's asking a lot, Caleb continued. I know it'll be hard, being that visible. But I want to take you, Evelyn. I want to walk into that hall with you on my arm and dance with you where everyone can see and show this whole town that you deserve to be celebrated, not hidden. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse. The harvest dance would be worse than the barn raising, more formal, more structured, more opportunities for public humiliation. At a barn raising, people were focused on work. At the harvest dance, the entire point was social performance. But she thought about yesterday, about dancing with Caleb under the lanterns while the town watched, about the way it had felt to choose visibility over safety, to let herself be seen, and discovered that being seen wasn't always the same as being destroyed. I haven't been to a harvest dance in 5 years, she said slowly. The last time I went, it was... She trailed off, not wanting to relive the specifics. Bad? Caleb guessed. Humiliating. The word came out flat. I spent the entire evening watching everyone else dance while I stood alone. And when someone finally did ask me, it was only because his friends had bet him he wouldn't. Caleb's jaw tightened. I want their names. It doesn't matter. That was 5 years ago. It matters to me. His voice was hard. Because that never should have happened to you. You should have danced every dance. You should have been the one everyone wanted to partner with. Well, I wasn't. I was the blacksmith's daughter, who was too strong and too strange and too everything the town didn't want to acknowledge. Evelyn pulled away slightly, wrapping her arms around herself. And now I'm the blacksmith, who's even more of those things. Do you really think the harvest dance will be different? Yes, Caleb said with absolute certainty, because you won't be standing alone. You'll be there with me, and I will make sure every single person in that hall understands that you are wanted, you are valued, and you are the most beautiful woman in the room. Caleb, I know you don't believe it yet. I know the town has spent years teaching you not to, but I'm going to spend however long it takes teaching you different. He reached for her hands again. Please come with me. Let me show you what it should have been like 5 years ago. Let me give you a night where you're celebrated instead of pitied. Evelyn wanted to say no, wanted to protect herself from the potential hurt, from the weight of all those eyes watching and judging. But she also wanted what Caleb was offering, the possibility of rewriting that humiliating memory, of walking into that space as someone chosen rather than someone avoided. If I go, she said carefully, I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not. I won't wear long sleeves to hide my arms or act demure or any of the things they think a proper woman should do. Good. I don't want you to. And if people are cruel, if they make comments or refuse to dance near us or any of the dozen other ways they might express their disapproval, then we'll deal with it together, Caleb interrupted. But Evelyn, we can't live our lives afraid of what might happen. We can't let their potential judgment stop us from building something real. He was right. She knew he was right. But knowing and doing were separated by a vast gulf of fear. 3 weeks? She asked. 3 weeks. Plenty of time to change your mind if you want to. I won't change my mind. She said it before she could reconsider, throwing herself off the cliff before fear could root her in place. I'll go with you to the harvest dance. The joy that lit Caleb's face was worth every ounce of terror the decision cost her. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, talking and laughing, and occasionally working at the forge, Caleb attempting more practice pieces, while Evelyn supervised with patient amusement. When the light began to fade and Caleb finally prepared to leave, Evelyn walked him to where his horse was tethered. Thank you for today, she said, for wanting to see this place, for understanding why it matters. Thank you for showing me. He swung into the saddle, looking down at her with an expression that made her breath catch. I'll see you Friday? For the contract meeting at Broken Creek? Friday, she confirmed. In all the emotion of planning for the harvest dance, she'd almost forgotten about the potential ranch contract. I'll be there. Good. He touched his hat brim. And Evelyn? Start thinking about what dress you want to wear to the dance. I want you to feel beautiful. I don't own anything beautiful, she said honestly. Then we'll find something, or make something, whatever you need. He smiled. You're going to steal every eye in that hall, Evelyn Hart. Time they all saw what I see when I look at you. He rode off before she could respond, leaving Evelyn standing in the gathering dusk with her heart racing and her mind spinning with equal parts terror and anticipation. The harvest dance. In 3 weeks, she would walk into the very place that had humiliated her 5 years ago, and she would do it openly, courted by a man who seemed to genuinely believe she deserved celebration. The thought made her want to vomit and fly at the same time. The following weeks passed in a blur of work and preparation and mounting anxiety. The contract meeting at Broken Creek went better than Evelyn had dared hope. Wade, the foreman, proved to be exactly as practical as Caleb had suggested. He examined samples of her work, asked pointed questions about her capabilities and her pricing, and hired her on the spot to handle the ranch's heavier metalwork. "Don't care who does the work as long as it's done right," Wade had said, his weathered face completely neutral. "You prove you can handle it, you'll have steady business from us. You prove you can't, the contract ends. Simple as that." It was the most straightforward business arrangement Evelyn had experienced since taking over the forge. No commentary on her gender, no surprised remarks about her strength, no elaborate justifications for why they were willing to work with her. Just recognition of skill and a clear set of expectations. She'd left the ranch with a contract for regular work and a lightness in her chest that felt like vindication. Caleb visited the forge several times a week, sometimes with legitimate need for her services. A thrown horseshoe, a broken bit that needed repair, but more often just to see her. They fell into an easy rhythm, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that should have taken months to develop, but somehow felt natural from the start. He brought her lunch one afternoon, appearing at her forge with bread and cheese and apples wrapped in cloth. They ate sitting on the bench outside, watching the town move through its daily routines, and Caleb told her stories about growing up on a small ranch in Nevada, about the brother who'd died young and the parents who'd followed not long after. "Is that why you kept moving?" Evelyn asked. "Because staying in one place hurt too much?" "Maybe. Or maybe I just hadn't found a place worth staying for yet." He looked at her meaningfully, and Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks. She told him about her mother, who died when Evelyn was 12, leaving her father to raise a daughter who showed no interest in typical feminine pursuits. About how her father had simply accepted her preferences and taught her the forge instead of trying to force her into a mold she'd never fit. "He sounds like a good man," Caleb said. "The best. He never made me feel wrong for being exactly what I was." "Neither will I," Caleb promised. But as the harvest dance approached, Evelyn's anxiety mounted. She'd agreed to go, had committed to walking into that space with her head held high, but the actual reality of it grew more terrifying with each passing day. The dress became a particular source of stress. Evelyn owned exactly 2 dresses, the simple calico she'd worn to the barn raising and an even plainer work dress she used for church when she'd still attended. Neither felt appropriate for the harvest dance, which demanded a certain level of formality. She was considering whether she could somehow make do with the calico when Mrs. Chen appeared at her forge one afternoon, carrying a wrapped package. "For the dance," the older woman announced, setting the package on Evelyn's workbench. "Mrs. Chen, I can't." "You can. Open it." Inside the wrapping was a dress in deep burgundy, the color of wine held up to lamplight. The fabric was simple but good quality, and the cut was elegant without being fussy. Most importantly, the sleeves were elbow length, long enough to be respectable, but short enough that Evelyn's arms would be visible. "Mrs. Chen," Evelyn breathed, running her fingers over the fabric, "this is too much." "It is exactly enough." The older woman's expression was firm. "You go to this dance, you hold your head high, you show them you are not ashamed. This dress will help." "But how did you— the cost?" "I make dresses before I run restaurant," Mrs. Chen said. "This is old skill, not expensive for me. You accept with grace and wear with pride." Evelyn's throat tightened. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." "Say you will wear it and not hide yourself." Mrs. Chen's hand came to rest briefly on Evelyn's shoulder. "You are a good woman, Evelyn Hart. You deserve good things. Time you start believing this." She left before Evelyn could respond, leaving the dress and its implicit message. "You are worth celebrating." That night, Evelyn tried on the dress in the privacy of her cabin. It fit perfectly, skimming her strong shoulders and falling in clean lines that somehow made her feel elegant rather than awkward. The burgundy color brought out warmth in her complexion, and the shorter sleeves framed her muscled arms in a way that felt intentional rather than apologetic. She looked at herself in the small mirror, seeing not the woman the town called unnatural, but someone who might, just might, be beautiful in her own way. The night of the harvest dance arrived too quickly and not fast enough. Evelyn spent the afternoon in a state of nervous energy, second-guessing her decision to go a dozen times before finally forcing herself to get ready. She bathed carefully, washing away the ever-present traces of soot and metal. She braided her hair and pinned it up in a style that was simple but neat. She put on the burgundy dress and her only pair of good shoes, and she looked at herself in the mirror one final time. "You can do this," she told her reflection. "You can walk in there and be seen and survive it." Her reflection looked skeptical but resolute. Caleb arrived as the sun was setting, dressed in clean trousers and a pressed shirt, his hair still damp from his own washing. When Evelyn opened the door, his face went still with something that looked like awe. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "you're beautiful." "It's just a dress," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "It's not the dress." He stepped closer, his eyes serious. "Though the dress is perfect. But it's you. The way you're standing here despite being terrified. The courage it took to put on something that shows your arms instead of hiding them. The way you're choosing to be seen." He took her hand. "That's what's beautiful." Evelyn had to blink against sudden tears. "I'm scared." "I know. But you're going anyway, and that's what makes you the bravest person I know." He offered his arm. "Ready?" She took a breath, placed her hand on his arm, and stepped out into the evening. "Ready." The harvest dance was held in the largest barn in the valley, belonging to the Patterson family, who owned more land than anyone else in the territory. By the time Evelyn and Caleb arrived, the barn was already full of people. Families in their best clothes, young couples dancing, older folks sitting along the walls watching the festivities. Evelyn felt every eye turn toward them as they entered, felt the conversations pause, the attention sharpen, the collective assessment begin. She wanted to run, to turn around and flee back to the safety of her forge, where no one could see her trying to be something she'd been told she couldn't be. But Caleb's hand covered hers on his arm, warm and steady, and he walked into that barn like they belonged there. Like there was nothing unusual about the blacksmith attending the harvest dance on the arm of the Broken Creek ranch hand. They found a space near the refreshment table, and Caleb got them both glasses of punch while Evelyn tried to calm her racing heart. She could see Mrs. Henderson across the room, whispering urgently to Alice Morrison. Could see Thomas Wright's brother, the same one who'd asked her to dance on a dare 5 years ago, staring at her with undisguised shock. "Evelyn." She turned to find Sarah Hutchinson approaching, her husband trailing behind. "I'm glad you came," Sarah said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. "That dress is beautiful. Where did you get it?" "Mrs. Chen made it for me." "She has excellent taste." Sarah glanced toward the dance floor where couples were already moving to a lively tune. "You and Caleb should dance. Show these old biddies that there's more than one way to be a woman in this town." Her husband, a quiet man named David, nodded his agreement. "Been telling Sarah for years that the town could use more women like you, Miss Hart. Women who know their own minds and don't apologize for it." The support surprised Evelyn into speechlessness. She'd categorized everyone in K-Fax as either actively hostile or passively uncomfortable with her existence. The possibility that some people might actually admire her choices had never occurred to her. Before she could respond, Caleb returned with their drinks, and the fiddler struck up a new song, something slower, more intimate. A few couples moved on to the dance floor, and Caleb turned to Evelyn with a question in his eyes. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Dancing with Caleb at a barn raising was one thing, casual, outdoors, less formal. But this was the harvest dance, the center of the town's social calendar, and stepping onto that floor would make a statement that couldn't be unmade. Evelyn set down her punch glass and took Caleb's offered hand. They walked onto the dance floor together, and the room went quiet. Not completely, conversations continued, the fiddler kept playing, but there was a noticeable hush, a collective holding of breath as people watched the blacksmith and her beau take their place among the dancing couples. Caleb pulled her close, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers, and they began to move to the music. Evelyn was acutely aware of every eye on them, every whispered comment, every assessment being made. Her shoulders wanted to hunch, her body wanted to make itself smaller, but Caleb held her firmly, steadying her with his presence. "Look at me," he said quietly. "Not at them, just at me." She did, meeting his eyes, and found warmth and pride, and something that looked dangerously like love. The world narrowed to his face, to the music, to the rhythm of their movement together. "They're staring," she whispered. "Let them stare. Let them see how proud I am to be here with you. Let them see that you deserve every bit of attention you're getting, and it's all admiration from where I'm standing." "Not all admiration," Evelyn noted, catching sight of Mrs. Henderson's pinched face over Caleb's shoulder. "The ones whose opinions matter," Caleb amended, "and those people see exactly what I do. Strength and courage, and a woman who's too damn special to hide." They danced through the entire song, and when it ended, Caleb didn't lead her off the floor. Instead, they stayed for the next dance and the one after that, claiming their space with quiet determination. Other couples began joining them, Frank from Broken Creek with his wife, Sarah and David Hutchinson, even a few of the younger ranch hands with their sweethearts. The dance floor filled, and Evelyn found herself part of the celebration rather than a spectacle at its edge. When they finally took a break, she was breathless and smiling, her earlier terror transformed into something that felt remarkably like joy. "See," Caleb said, bringing her fresh punch. "You survived." "I did more than survive." Evelyn looked around the barn, at the people dancing and talking and celebrating, and realized that she belonged here just as much as anyone. "I actually enjoyed myself." "Good. Because there are at least 4 more dances I'm planning to claim before the night's over." They spent the evening moving between the dance floor and conversations with the few townspeople who proved willing to engage with Evelyn directly. Not everyone was friendly. Mrs. Henderson made sure to sniff loudly whenever Evelyn passed, and several of the older men made a point of ignoring her entirely. But enough people were neutral or even welcoming that Evelyn began to feel like maybe, just maybe, the town's opinion of her wasn't as monolithic as she'd believed. Near the end of the evening, as they stood outside the barn catching cool air after a particularly energetic reel, Caleb turned to her with an expression that made her heart stutter. "Evelyn, I need to tell you something." His tone was serious enough that Evelyn felt her stomach drop. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right, actually, and that's what I need to say." He took both her hands in his. "I know we've only known each other 2 months. I know that's not long by any reasonable measure. But I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. And I hope, that you might feel the same way. Caleb, I'm not asking for anything yet," he continued. "I'm not rushing you or trying to push. I just need you to know that this isn't casual for me. That when I look at you, I see my future. And I wanted you to know that before we go any further, so you can decide if that's something you want too." Evelyn stood in the darkness outside the barn, with music and laughter spilling out behind them and stars scattered overhead, and felt the final wall around her heart crumble. "It's not casual for me either," she admitted. "It terrifies me how much it's not casual. But yes, Caleb, I want a future with you too." His smile could have lit the whole valley. He pulled her close and kissed her, and Evelyn kissed him back with all the hope and fear and fierce joy that had been building in her chest since the day he'd first walked into her forge. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Evelyn Hart," he said quietly. "I love your strength and your courage and your stubborn refusal to be anything other than exactly who you are. And I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that being loved doesn't mean being diminished." "I love you too," Evelyn whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and necessary. "I didn't think I could. I didn't think I was allowed to want this. But I do, and I love you." They stood together in the darkness, holding each other, while inside the barn the harvest dance continued without them. Tomorrow there would be gossip. Tomorrow the town would have things to say about the blacksmith and the ranch hand, about their public display, about the statement they'd made by dancing together under the eyes of the entire community. But tonight, Evelyn didn't care. Tonight she'd walked into the place of her humiliation and transformed it into a place of triumph. Tonight she danced with the man she loved and let the whole town see that she deserved celebration. Tonight she'd chosen visibility over safety and discovered that being seen could sometimes mean being loved. The woman who'd stood alone 5 years ago, watching everyone else dance, had become a woman who claimed her place on the floor. The blacksmith the town wouldn't accept had found someone who not only accepted her, but celebrated her exactly as she was. And as she stood in Caleb's arms under the stars, Evelyn finally understood what her father had meant when he said the forge was proof she didn't need anyone's permission to exist. She didn't need their permission to be loved either. She just needed the courage to believe she deserved it. The proposal came on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 months after the harvest dance, in the most ordinary of circumstances. Evelyn was shoeing a horse for one of the Broken Creek hands when Caleb appeared in the forge doorway, his hat in his hands, and an expression on his face that made her set down her hammer mid-strike. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Nothing's wrong," but his voice was tight with some emotion she couldn't identify. "I just need to ask you something, and I can't wait another day to do it." The horse shifted, and Evelyn automatically steadied it before turning her full attention to Caleb. "Ask me what?" He crossed the space between them, dropping to one knee right there in the forge yard, his trousers getting dusty and his hand still clutching his hat. "Marry me," he said, the words tumbling out without preamble or poetry. "I know this isn't romantic. I know I should have planned something better, taken you somewhere special. But I woke up this morning and the only thought in my head was that I want to spend every morning for the rest of my life waking up knowing you're mine and I'm yours. So marry me, Evelyn Hart, please." Evelyn stood frozen, the hammer heavy in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs with more force than she'd ever brought to bear on metal. She'd known this was coming eventually. They'd been courting openly for months, and their intentions toward each other were clear to anyone who cared to notice. But the reality of it, the actual moment of being asked, hit her with unexpected force. "I don't have a ring," Caleb continued, still on one knee, his voice gaining steadiness. "I'm working on one. Been teaching myself metalwork from that book you lent me, but it's not finished yet, and I couldn't wait. I couldn't spend another day not having asked you." "Stand up," Evelyn said, her voice rough. Caleb stood, uncertainty flickering across his face. "Is that a no?" "It's I can't say yes to a man who's kneeling in forge dust when I'm covered in soot and probably smell like a horse." She set down the hammer with deliberate care. "Ask me properly." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a smile that made her breath catch. He brushed off his knees, stepped close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, and took both her hands in his. "Evelyn Hart," he said, his voice steady now and sure. "You are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. You've taught me that love doesn't require anyone to be less than they are. It requires both people to be fully themselves and choose each other anyway. I want to build a life with you. I want to support your work and celebrate your strength and prove every single day that you deserve to be loved exactly as you are. Will you marry me?" The tears came before Evelyn could stop them, tracking clean paths through the soot on her face. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Caleb pulled her into his arms, lifting her clean off her feet and spinning her around while she laughed and cried at the same time. When he set her down, they were both grinning like fools, and the horse Evelyn had been shoeing snorted impatiently at being forgotten. "I have to finish this shoe," Evelyn said, not releasing her hold on Caleb's shirt. "I know. And then we should probably talk about what this means, where we'll live, what happens to the forge." "We will." He kissed her forehead. "But right now, can we just be happy about this? Just for a minute?" So they stood together in the forge yard, holding each other while the morning sun climbed higher and the world continued around them, and let themselves be simply, completely happy. The wedding took place 2 months later, in May, when the mountains were green and the valley was full of wildflowers. They married in a small ceremony at the courthouse, with Mrs. Chen and Wade from Broken Creek as witnesses, because neither Evelyn nor Caleb wanted the spectacle of a church wedding. Mrs. Henderson had opinions about this, naturally. She expressed them loudly to anyone who would listen, declaring that a proper wedding required a proper ceremony and suggesting that the courthouse arrangement proved the blacksmith knew she didn't really deserve celebration. But Evelyn had stopped letting Mrs. Henderson's opinions carry weight months ago. She married Caleb in a simple cream-colored dress with wildflowers in her hair that Mrs. Chen had woven there that morning, and she spoke her vows in a steady voice that held no shame or apology. "I promise to stand beside you as an equal partner," she said, looking into Caleb's eyes while the judge waited patiently, "to support your dreams while pursuing my own. To be honest even when it's hard and gentle when I can manage it. To love you with all my strength and let you love me in return." Caleb's vows were simpler but no less meaningful. "I promise to see you clearly every day of our lives, to celebrate your strength instead of fearing it, to build a life where you never have to choose between being loved and being yourself, to prove that you deserve everything good this world has to offer." The judge pronounced them married, and Caleb kissed his wife while Mrs. Chen dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Wade cleared his throat roughly and tried to pretend he wasn't moved. They'd settled the question of where to live weeks earlier after long conversations that sometimes became arguments but always ended in understanding. Caleb had wanted Evelyn to keep the forge, had insisted on it, actually, but the small cabin behind it barely had room for one person, let alone two. "We could add on to it," Evelyn had suggested. "Expand the cabin, make it big enough for both of us. Or," Caleb had countered carefully, "we could think bigger, build an actual house, something with room to grow." "With what money? The forge does well enough, but not well enough to fund house construction. I've been saving my wages from Broken Creek, and I talked to Wade. He said the ranch would be willing to advance me some of next year's pay if I needed it for building. They want to keep me on long term, and they figure a married man with a house is more likely to stay than a hand living in the bunkhouse." They'd walked the property behind the forge, measuring with their eyes and their hopes. There was room enough for a proper house if they positioned it right. Room for a kitchen big enough to cook real meals in, a bedroom that wasn't cramped, maybe even a second room eventually for children if they were blessed with them. "I can do most of the construction work myself," Caleb had said. "Between ranch work and the forge, we both know building. We could hire help for what we can't manage alone." "It'll take months," Evelyn had warned. "Then it takes months. We've got time." They'd started construction 2 weeks after the proposal, working evenings and Sundays when Caleb wasn't at the ranch and Evelyn could spare time from the forge. Other people had joined them. Frank and some of the Broken Creek hands, Sarah and David Hutchinson, even a few townspeople who seemed to have softened their stance on the blacksmith now that she was respectably married. The work was hard and slow, made slower by the fact that neither Evelyn nor Caleb would accept charity. They paid everyone who helped, even when people protested, because Evelyn had learned early that accepting too much kindness could turn into owing too many favors. By the time they married in May, the house was half built, walls up, roof partially complete, windows waiting to be installed. They spent their wedding night in the cabin, cramped but happy, and woke the next morning to continue work on what would become their home. The first real test of their marriage came 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon when Caleb suggested Evelyn might want to attend church with him. "I don't go to church," Evelyn said carefully, setting down the plans for the house's front porch. "You knew that when you married me." "I know, and I'm not asking you to change your mind about attending regular services." Caleb's tone was diplomatic. "But there's a baptism next Sunday, Frank's new baby. He asked if we'd come, both of us. As a gesture of support." Evelyn felt the familiar tightness in her chest. "The last time I was in that church, Reverend Matthews suggested from the pulpit that women who abandoned traditional roles were abandoning their duties to the community. Half the congregation stared at me the entire service. I haven't been back since." "I understand why you left. And if you never want to go back, that's your choice and I'll support it." Caleb moved closer, his expression open. "But Evelyn, Frank has been good to us. He helped build this house. He stood up for you when some of the other hands made comments. This matters to him. And what about what matters to me? The fact that walking into that building feels like walking into a room full of people who think I'm wrong for existing." "You're not wrong for existing." Caleb's voice was firm. "And maybe one way to prove that is to walk in there with your head high and remind them that you're part of this community, whether they like it or not." They argued about it for an hour, both of them getting heated, voices rising, until finally Evelyn threw up her hands. "Fine," she said. "Fine. I'll go to the baptism, but don't expect me to enjoy it, and don't expect me to make this a regular thing." "I'm not expecting anything except for you to be yourself," Caleb said quietly. "That's all I've ever expected." The baptism was exactly as uncomfortable as Evelyn had anticipated. She and Caleb arrived together, and the congregation's attention turned to them like sunflowers tracking light. She could feel the assessments being made, the whispers starting, the old judgments being refreshed and renewed. But she also felt Caleb's hand solid in hers, anchoring her. Felt the way he walked into that church like they had every right to be there, like Evelyn's presence was something to be proud of rather than something to apologize for. Frank and his wife Rachel stood at the front with their baby daughter, and when they caught sight of Evelyn and Caleb, their faces lit with genuine welcome. After the service, Rachel brought the baby over to where Evelyn and Caleb stood slightly apart from the main clusters of people. "Thank you for coming," Rachel said warmly. "It means the world to us that you're here." "She's beautiful," Evelyn said, looking at the baby with something that felt dangerously like longing. "Congratulations." "Frank tells me you're building a house," Rachel continued. "That must be exciting, planning for the future and all." There was no judgment in her tone, just friendly interest. Evelyn felt some of her defensive tension ease. "It's coming along slowly," she admitted. "Between the forge and Caleb's ranch work, we're fitting construction in where we can." "Well, if you need help with any of the interior work, sewing curtains, that sort of thing, I'd be happy to assist." Rachel shifted the baby to her other arm. "I know we haven't been close, but I'd like that to change. There aren't many young married women in KFAX, and I think we could be friends if you were willing." The offer surprised Evelyn into silence. Friends. She'd had so few of those since her father died, had learned to expect isolation rather than connection. "I'd like that," she managed finally. They talked for a few more minutes before Rachel was called away by her mother, and Evelyn found herself standing in the church courtyard feeling something she hadn't felt in years, the possibility of belonging somewhere beyond her forge. On the walk home, Caleb reached for her hand. "Thank you for coming. I know it wasn't easy." "It wasn't as terrible as I expected," Evelyn admitted. "Rachel was kind. Frank seemed genuinely happy we were there. Even Reverend Matthews nodded at me without looking pained about it." "People are starting to see what I've always seen," Caleb said. "That you're not a threat or an aberration. You're just a woman living her life the best way she knows how." "Some people will never see that." "Then they're the ones losing out, not you." By late summer, the house was complete enough to move into. It was simple compared to some of the grander homes in KFAX, but it was solidly built and entirely theirs. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with an actual stove instead of just a fireplace, a main room large enough to host guests if they ever wanted to, windows that let in light and air, a front porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the mountains turn purple with dusk. The forge stood separate but close, its familiar shape a reminder that Evelyn hadn't given up anything essential to gain this new life. She still worked there every day, still took on projects from the ranch and from townspeople who needed her skills. But now she had somewhere else to return to at day's end. Someone waiting with dinner started and stories to share about his day at the ranch. The rhythm of married life settled over them like well-worn leather, comfortable and flexible. Caleb rose before dawn for ranch work, and Evelyn lit the forge fire while he was gone. They met for lunch when they could, sharing whatever simple meal Evelyn had thrown together or Caleb had brought from the ranch kitchen. Evenings were spent working on house improvements, talking through their days, occasionally arguing about small things that never seemed to matter much in the morning. It wasn't perfect. Perfection would have required the town's complete acceptance, and that remained elusive. Mrs. Henderson still made pointed comments about wives who worked like men. Some of the older women still crossed the street to avoid Evelyn. The general store owner still served her last, making her wait while he attended to other customers first. But Evelyn had Caleb, and she had her forge, and she had a growing network of people who treated her with respect if not always understanding. She had Rachel, who came by once a week to share tea and gossip and friendship. She had Wade, who continued to bring her steady work from the ranch. She had Mrs. Chen, whose wisdom and support had never wavered. She had, for the first time since her father died, something that felt like a life instead of just a survival. The first real crisis came in October, when money got tight. The forge work had been steady through summer, plenty of horseshoes needed, plenty of repairs as people prepared for winter. But an early frost damaged some of the valley's crops, and when people had less money for harvest, they had less money for the blacksmith. Work slowed to a trickle just as the bills for house construction came due. Evelyn sat at their kitchen table one evening, adding columns of numbers that refused to come out right no matter how many times she recalculated. "We're short," she said finally, setting down her pencil. "Even with the ranch contract, we're going to be short for the lumber payment." Caleb looked up from where he was mending a bridle. "How short?" $20. "Maybe 25 if we want to eat anything other than beans for the next month." He was quiet for a long moment, his hand stilling on the leather. "I could ask Wade for an advance on next month's wages." "You already took an advance for the house construction. If you keep asking, they'll think you can't manage your money." "Then what do you suggest?" Evelyn stared at the numbers, hating what she was about to propose. "I could sell some of my father's tools, the ones I don't use regularly. There are collectors who'd pay good money for quality pieces." "Evelyn, no." Caleb set down the bridle entirely. "Those tools are your inheritance, your connection to your father. We're not selling them." "Then what else is there?" "We can't not pay the lumber supplier. We still need materials to finish the house. And winter's coming. We need that second bedroom completed before the cold really sets in." They argued about it until they were both exhausted, circling the same territory without finding resolution. Finally, Caleb stood, his jaw tight with frustration. "I'm going to take a walk," he said. "I need to clear my head." He left, and Evelyn sat alone in their half-finished house, staring at numbers that represented impossible choices. Keep her father's legacy, or keep their home construction on track. Maintain her pride, or accept that sometimes survival required sacrifice. She was still sitting there when Caleb returned an hour later, his expression determined. "I talked to Wade," he said without preamble. "Told him our situation. He's willing to give me extra hours, help with the winter fence repairs that usually wait until spring. It won't be a full $25, but it'll close the gap enough that you won't have to sell your father's tools." "Caleb, you already work from dawn to dusk, and I can work longer if that's what it takes to keep you from having to give up something that matters." He crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair. "We're partners, Evelyn. That means when one of us is struggling, the other one helps carry the weight. Let me do this." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't want you to kill yourself working double hours because I can't bring in enough forge income." "The forge income is fine. This is just a rough patch. Everyone's dealing with the crop damage. It'll even out." His hand covered hers on the table. "And I'm not killing myself. I'm working hard to build a life with the woman I love. There's a difference." They made it through the lumber payment, through the lean months of late fall when work was sparse for both of them. Caleb took the extra hours, and Evelyn stretched what little money the forge brought in as far as it would go. They ate simply, spent nothing on luxuries, and worked together to finish the house before winter truly set in. By December, when the first serious snow fell, they had a completed home. Both bedrooms finished, the roof sound, the windows properly sealed against the cold. It wasn't grand, but it was warm and solid and entirely theirs, built with their own hands and their combined determination. Christmas Eve found them sitting by the fire in their main room, both exhausted from the work of the past months, but satisfied. Caleb had brought home a small pine tree, and Evelyn had made simple decorations from scraps of fabric and wire. It wasn't much, but it transformed their simple room into something that felt festive. "I have something for you," Caleb said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small cloth-wrapped package and handed it to Evelyn. She unwrapped it carefully to find a ring, not a traditional wedding band, but something he'd clearly made himself. The metal was iron from her forge, worked and shaped into an elegant band with a small design hammered into the surface. When she looked closer, she realized the design was a tiny anvil. "I know it's not gold," Caleb said, watching her face anxiously, "and the work is probably crude compared to what you could do. But I wanted you to have something that represented us. Your strength and skill, my appreciation of both." Evelyn slipped the ring onto her finger, feeling the weight of it, the meaning. "It's perfect," she whispered. "It's absolutely perfect." She pulled out her own gift then, a leather belt she'd been working on for months, tooled with designs of mountains and horses and the ranch brand from Broken Creek. She'd commissioned the leather from the tanner and done the tooling work herself in stolen hours when Caleb was away. "For when your old one finally gives up," she said as he examined it with wonder. They exchanged gifts, and then they simply sat together by the fire, Evelyn's head on Caleb's shoulder, both of them tired and content, and surrounded by the evidence of what they'd built together. "This has been a hard year," Evelyn said quietly. "It has. But a good one, too. The best." Caleb kissed the top of her head. "And next year will be better. We'll have the house paid off, business will pick back up, and we'll have solid ground under our feet." He was right. The new year brought renewed prosperity as the town recovered from the crop damage. Forge work picked up as people replaced tools and equipment they'd been making do with. Caleb's position at Broken Creek became permanent, with a modest raise that made their budget considerably less tight. By spring, they had enough saved to think about the future beyond just survival. One evening in April, as they worked together in the vegetable garden they'd started behind the house, Caleb brought up the subject that had been hovering between them for months. "Have you thought about children?" he asked, pulling weeds with deliberate casualness. Evelyn paused in her planting. "I've thought about it. And I'm scared," she admitted. "Scared of what pregnancy would do to my ability to work the forge. Scared of becoming a mother when I never had much example of how to do it right. Scared that I'll be terrible at the soft parts of motherhood because I've spent my whole life developing the hard parts." "You won't be terrible," Caleb said with certainty. "You'll be yourself, which means you'll be honest and strong and teach our children that there's no one right way to be a person." "But what about the forge? If I'm pregnant, I can't work around the heavy heat. Can't lift the hammer for hours on end, can't—" "Then we adapt," Caleb interrupted gently. "Maybe you take on lighter work during pregnancy. Maybe I learn enough metal work to handle some of the heavier pieces. Maybe we hire someone temporarily to help with the forge while you're recovering. There are solutions, Evelyn, if we want this." "Do you want this?" she asked. "I want a family with you, however that looks. Whenever it happens. But only if you want it too." Evelyn looked at their house, at the garden they were planting, at the life they'd built from nothing but determination and love. She thought about her father, about the legacy he'd left her, about what it might mean to pass that legacy forward to another generation. "I want it," she said finally. "I'm terrified, but I want it." They tried for a baby that summer, and by autumn, Evelyn was pregnant. The reality of it hit her harder than she'd anticipated, the morning sickness that made working the forge nearly impossible for weeks, the exhaustion that pulled at her like a physical weight, the gradual changes to her body that made her familiar strength feel foreign and uncertain. But Caleb was there through all of it, learning the forge work well enough to handle simple repairs, bringing her ginger tea for the nausea, rubbing her aching back in the evenings. And Rachel became an unexpected source of support, visiting regularly to share advice and reassurance from her own experience with pregnancy. "It gets better," Rachel promised during one particularly miserable week. "The first few months are awful, but then you start to feel human again. And by the end, you'll be so ready to meet this baby that you won't even care about the discomfort." She was right. By the time winter arrived, Evelyn had regained most of her energy and returned to lighter forge work. She couldn't manage the heavy hammer anymore, but she could do detail work, repairs, sharpening. Caleb handled the horseshoes and the larger pieces, his skills improving with practice. Their daughter was born in March, during a late snow that blanketed the valley in white. The labor was long and hard, attended by Mrs. Chen and Rachel, with Caleb pacing anxiously in the main room until Mrs. Chen finally told him he could come in. "She's perfect," the older woman said, placing the baby in Evelyn's arms. "Strong, like her mother." Evelyn looked down at the tiny, red-faced creature she'd created, and felt something in her chest crack open with love so fierce it was almost painful. This small person, helpless and perfect, was hers to protect and raise and teach how to be strong in a world that often punished strength in women. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." They named her Clara, after Evelyn's mother, and she transformed their lives in ways both exhausting and wonderful. Evelyn learned to work the forge with a baby strapped to her back, Clara sleeping peacefully despite the heat and noise. She learned to balance motherhood with her craft, accepting that some days the forge had to wait while she tended to her daughter's needs. Caleb proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle with Clara, while still maintaining his work at the ranch. They divided responsibilities as they had everything else, based on ability and availability rather than rigid gender roles. Caleb changed diapers and soothed crying fits. Evelyn returned to forge work as soon as she was physically able, grateful for the way her body remembered its strength even after the changes of pregnancy. The town, predictably, had opinions about their parenting choices. Mrs. Henderson declared it shocking that Evelyn would work the forge instead of staying home with her infant. Alice Morrison suggested darkly that no good would come of a child raised in such an unconventional household. But Evelyn had stopped caring about their opinions months ago. Clara was healthy and loved and surrounded by people who wanted the best for her. That was what mattered. By the time Clara turned 1, the forge was thriving again, the house was paid off, and the tight months of their first year seemed like distant memory. They'd built something solid and real, something that couldn't be diminished by gossip or disapproval. One evening in late summer, as they sat on their porch watching Clara toddle around the yard, Caleb reached for Evelyn's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing this life? Marrying me instead of someone who might have made things easier?" Evelyn looked at him, at this man who'd walked into her forge 2 years ago and seen her clearly, who'd never asked her to be anything other than herself, who'd supported her dreams while building a life alongside her. "Never," she said firmly. "Not once. This is exactly the life I was meant to have. Even with the struggles, the tight money and the town gossip, and all the hard parts?" "Especially with those things," Evelyn said, "because we faced them together and came out stronger. Because you taught me that being loved doesn't mean being diminished. Because every challenge we've overcome has proven that we chose right." Caleb lifted her hand to his lips, kissing the iron ring he'd made her 2 years ago. "I love you, Evelyn Rowe." "I love you too." She leaned against his shoulder, watching their daughter play in the fading light. "And I love the life we've built. All of it." They sat together as the sun set, their daughter playing nearby, their house solid behind them, and the forge standing ready for tomorrow's work. It wasn't the life anyone in Kfax had imagined for the unmarriageable blacksmith, but it was real, and it was theirs, and that made it more valuable than any amount of approval could ever be out. Part 5. Lưu ý ộ. Viết 6.000 đến 6.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phủ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man. Phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Lưu ý trả lời trong múc tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chỉ dẫn bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more 16 giờ 52 phút part 5. The years unfolded like pages in a book written by two authors who'd learned each other's handwriting. Clara grew from a toddler into a curious child who showed no fear of the forge, who watched her mother work with the same fascination Evelyn had once brought to watching her own father. By the time she was 5, Clara could identify every tool in the workshop and knew instinctively when to stay clear of the hot metal and when it was safe to approach. "Can I try?" she asked one afternoon, watching Evelyn shape a horseshoe. Evelyn paused, the question carrying weight beyond its simple words. This was the same question she'd asked her father at age 10, the question that had set her on the path that defined her life. The answer she gave Clara now would matter. "You can watch and learn," Evelyn said carefully. "And when you're old enough to hold the hammer steady, I'll teach you properly, just like my father taught me." Did people think it was strange that Papa taught you instead of teaching you sewing and cooking? The question surprised Evelyn into stillness. Clara was only 5, but she'd already noticed the differences in their household, the ways their family didn't quite match the patterns she saw elsewhere. Some people did think it was strange, Evelyn admitted, setting down her hammer to give Clara her full attention. Some people still do, but my father believed that the best gift he could give me was the ability to take care of myself, to make things people needed, to never depend on someone else's permission to survive. Is that why you work here, even though Mama Henderson says women shouldn't? Evelyn felt a flash of anger at Mrs. Henderson for poisoning her daughter's mind, but she forced it down. Clara needed understanding, not rage. I work here because I'm good at it and because I love it, she said simply. And yes, because it means I can take care of myself and contribute to our family. Mrs. Henderson has her own ideas about how women should live, but they're just that, her ideas. They don't have to be yours or mine. Clara considered this with the seriousness of childhood. I think you're the best blacksmith in the whole valley. Well, I'm certainly the only female one, Evelyn said with a slight smile. But thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot. By the time Clara turned 7, a second child had joined the family, a son they named James, who had Caleb's quiet temperament and Evelyn's stubborn determination. The house that had once seemed spacious now felt perfectly full, alive with the noise of children and the constant motion of family life. Evelyn had learned to balance motherhood and the forge with increasing skill, though some days still felt like juggling hot coals. She'd trained herself to work efficiently in shorter bursts, to plan her forge time around the children's needs, to accept that being a mother and a blacksmith meant neither role would ever receive her undivided attention. Caleb had become indispensable at both the ranch and the forge, his skills with metalwork improving to the point where he could handle most repairs independently. They'd fallen into a rhythm where Evelyn managed the specialized work and customer relationships while Caleb supplemented with the routine tasks, all while maintaining his position at Broken Creek. "We make a good team," he said one evening after they'd put the children to bed and were reviewing the week's accounts together. "We always have," Evelyn replied, leaning against his shoulder. "Though I don't think either of us imagined it would look quite like this when you first walked into my forge." "I imagined something," Caleb said. "Maybe not the specifics, but the feeling. This sense that you were someone I could build a life with. Someone who wouldn't expect me to be anything other than myself while I extended you the same courtesy." It was true. They'd built something rare, a partnership where both people remained fully themselves while creating something larger than either could have managed alone. The forge thrived, the ranch work continued, the children grew healthy and loved, and somehow they managed it all without either of them disappearing into the machinery of the other's needs. But the town's acceptance remained complicated. Mrs. Henderson had never softened her stance, and she'd recruited a cohort of like-minded women who seemed to take personal offense at Evelyn's continued existence as both mother and blacksmith. They whispered that the children were being raised improperly, that Clara was learning unladylike skills, that James would grow up confused about proper gender roles. The criticism might have stung more if Evelyn hadn't developed such a strong circle of genuine support. Rachel and her family had become close friends, often sharing Sunday dinners and helping with childcare when needed. Wade and several of the ranch hands treated Evelyn with respect that bordered on admiration. Mrs. Chen remained a constant presence, offering wisdom and tea in equal measure. And then there was Sarah Hutchinson, who'd transformed from neutral observer to active ally over the years. "I'm organizing a women's group," Sarah announced one afternoon when she stopped by the forge to collect a repaired garden tool. Not a sewing circle or a church auxiliary, an actual group where women can discuss things that matter: business, property rights, education for our daughters. "I'd like you to be part of it." Evelyn paused in her work, uncertain she'd heard correctly. "A women's group that discusses business? Why not? Half the women in this town help run their husbands' enterprises, but we're not supposed to acknowledge it openly. And women like you who run their own businesses entirely, you have knowledge that could help others." Sarah's expression was earnest. "I'm tired of pretending we're all just ornamental. I want to create a space where we can be honest about our capabilities." "Mrs. Henderson will have an apoplexy," Evelyn observed. "Let her. She doesn't speak for all women in K-Fax, no matter how much she'd like to believe otherwise." The women's group started small, just Sarah, Evelyn, Rachel, Mrs. Chen, and 3 other women who were brave enough to attend despite the potential social consequences. They met monthly at Sarah's house, ostensibly for tea, but actually for frank discussions about money management, property law, business practices, and the challenges of being women with ambitions beyond domestic perfection. It was revolutionary in its ordinariness. They weren't demanding the vote or protesting in the streets. They were simply creating space to acknowledge that women's lives were more complex than the town's social scripts allowed, and that there was value in sharing knowledge across those complexities. "My husband thinks I'm playing cards," one woman confided during the 3rd meeting. "He has no idea I'm here learning how to read a contract." "Why not tell him?" Evelyn asked. "Because he'd forbid it. He thinks women shouldn't trouble themselves with business matters." The woman's voice was resigned but tinged with rebellion. "But his father's farm will be mine someday, and I'll be damned if I let someone cheat me out of it because I never learned to read a legal document." The group grew slowly but steadily. By the end of the first year, 12 women were attending regularly, and word had spread to neighboring towns. A woman from a settlement 20 miles away made the journey to ask Evelyn's advice about starting her own business. "How did you do it?" the woman asked, her eyes hungry for answers. "How did you convince people to take you seriously?" "I didn't convince anyone of anything," Evelyn said honestly. "I just did the work, did it well, and refused to apologize for being competent. Some people came around, some never did. But the ones who mattered, the ones who actually needed good metalwork, they cared more about quality than gender." "But weren't you afraid of failing, of being ridiculed, of ending up alone?" "Terrified," Evelyn admitted. "Every single day for the first year after my father died. But I was more afraid of giving up my father's legacy and losing the one thing I knew I was good at. Fear is useful if it makes you careful. It's only destructive if it makes you stop." The conversation stayed with her for days afterward, making her realize that her story had become something larger than just her personal experience. She'd become a symbol, whether she'd intended to or not, proof that women could forge their own paths if they were willing to endure the consequences. The recognition brought both pride and pressure. Pride that she might be making things easier for women who came after her. Pressure because symbols were expected to be perfect, and Evelyn was achingly aware of her imperfections. She brought her concerns to Caleb one evening after the children were asleep. "Women are looking to me like I have answers," she said, pacing their bedroom. "Like I've figured out some secret to balancing everything. But half the time I feel like I'm barely holding it all together. The forge is busy, but I'm always behind on orders. The children need more attention than I can give them. The house is constantly messy. I'm not the example they think I am." "You're exactly the example they need," Caleb said from where he sat on the bed, watching her pace. "Because you're real. You're not pretending it's easy or that you have it all figured out. You're showing them that it's possible to build a life that matters even when it's messy and hard and imperfect." "But what if I fail? What if the forge goes under, or I make a mistake with the children, or—" "Then you'll handle it the way you handle everything else, with strength and honesty and the determination to keep going." He caught her hand as she paced past, pulling her to sit beside him. "Evelyn, you've already succeeded at the hardest part. You've built a life that's authentically yours instead of one shaped by other people's expectations. Everything else is just details." She leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "When did you get so wise?" "I married a woman who taught me that strength comes in different forms. Some of it rubbed off." The years continued their relentless forward motion. Clara turned 12 and announced she wanted to learn the forge properly, not just observe. Evelyn started teaching her the fundamentals: how to read the fire, how to judge heat by color, how to position her body to maximize leverage instead of relying purely on strength she hadn't yet developed. "Some people will tell you this isn't appropriate work for a girl," Evelyn said during one of their early lessons. "They'll say you should be learning embroidery or practicing piano or preparing yourself to be someone's wife." "What should I tell them?" Clara asked, her face smudged with soot and determined. "Tell them thank you for their opinion, then go back to doing exactly what you want to do." Evelyn adjusted Clara's grip on the hammer. "Or better yet, don't tell them anything. Just live your life in a way that proves them wrong." James showed no interest in the forge, preferring books and mathematics, and Evelyn supported this just as completely. She'd learned from her own father that the point wasn't to force children into predetermined molds, but to help them discover their own strengths and passions. "Is it strange that I don't want to be a blacksmith?" James asked her one afternoon when he was 10. "Not at all. Why would it be strange?" "Because you and Papa and Clara all work with metal. I thought maybe I was supposed to want that too." Evelyn set down the piece she was working on and gave James her full attention. "You're supposed to want whatever genuinely interests you. If that's numbers and books, then that's what you should pursue. The point of teaching you about the forge isn't to force you into this profession. It's to show you that you can learn any skill if you're willing to work at it. Even if people think it's strange for someone like me?" "Especially then," Evelyn said firmly. "I spent years being told I couldn't be a blacksmith because of my gender. I'm not about to turn around and tell you that you can't pursue your interests because they don't match some arbitrary expectation." By the time Evelyn reached her 40th year, Hart's Forge had become a genuine institution in the valley. The business that had barely survived in her early years now employed Clara as an apprentice and occasionally hired seasonal help during busy periods. The ranch contract had expanded, and Evelyn had developed a reputation that drew customers from 3 counties over. But success brought its own challenges. The forge that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a demanding taskmaster, always requiring more time and energy than she had to give. The balance between work and family that had seemed manageable when the children were young became increasingly precarious as they grew older, and their needs became more complex. Clara at 16 was a skilled smith in her own right, but she was also navigating the complicated social landscape of being a young woman in a small town who worked with her hands and showed no interest in traditional feminine pursuits. Boys didn't know what to make of her. Girls her age found her strange. She came home from town one day with tears in her eyes and anger in her voice. "They called me unnatural," she said, the words breaking on a sob. "Sarah Morrison said no man would ever want to marry someone who looks like she could beat him in a fight." Evelyn felt the old familiar pain, the echo of every insult she'd endured, now reflected in her daughter's experience. She pulled Clara into a fierce hug. "Listen to me," she said. "The right person won't be afraid of your strength. The right person will admire it, will be proud of it, will want you to be exactly as strong as you are. And anyone who can't see that isn't worth a single tear." "But what if there is no right person? What if I end up alone because I'm too different?" "Then you'll have a life built on your own skills and your own choices, which is better than any life built on making yourself small enough for someone else's comfort." Evelyn pulled back to look Clara in the eyes. "But I don't think you'll be alone. I think you'll find what your father and I found, someone who sees clearly and loves completely." "How can you be sure?" "Because I see you, and you're remarkable. Anyone with sense will recognize that." Clara dried her tears and returned to the forge, and Evelyn sent up a silent wish that her daughter's path would be easier than her own had been, that the ground she'd broken might make the terrain slightly less hostile for the next generation. James, meanwhile, had announced his intention to attend university if they could afford it, to study mathematics and possibly become a teacher. The news filled Evelyn with pride and fear in equal measure. Pride that her son had such clear ambitions, fear about finding the money to support them. "We'll make it work," Caleb said when they discussed it privately. "Between the forge income and my wages, we can save enough for his first year. After that, maybe he can find work to help cover costs. It'll be tight. We've managed tight before. We can do it again." They saved and scrimped, taking on extra work and cutting every unnecessary expense. Evelyn expanded the forge's offerings to include decorative ironwork, gates, railings, artistic pieces that commanded higher prices than standard horseshoes. Caleb took on additional responsibilities at the ranch in exchange for a modest pay increase. By the time James turned 18, they had enough saved for his university expenses. The day he left for school, Evelyn stood in the yard and watched the wagon carry her son toward a future she'd helped make possible. And she felt a fierce satisfaction that her work, both at the forge and as a mother, had created opportunities for her children that went beyond what she'd ever imagined. "You did good," Caleb said quietly beside her. "We did good," she corrected. "None of this would have been possible without both of us." That winter, Caleb got sick. It started as a cough he couldn't shake, then progressed to fevers and weakness that kept him home from the ranch for the first time in 20 years. The doctor came and prescribed rest and fluids, but weeks passed and Caleb didn't improve. Evelyn found herself managing both the forge and the household while nursing her husband, and the strain began to show. She fell behind on orders. The house descended into chaos. Clara picked up as much slack as she could, but she was still learning and couldn't manage the heavier work alone. "I'm sorry," Caleb said one night, his voice weak. "I'm supposed to be helping, not adding to your burdens." "You're not a burden," Evelyn said fiercely, wiping his fevered forehead with a cool cloth. "You're my partner and my love, and you've carried me through plenty. Let me carry you through this." But privately, in the dark hours when Caleb was sleeping and she lay awake worrying about money and work and the terrifying possibility of losing him, Evelyn felt fear like she hadn't experienced since those early days after her father died. She'd built her entire adult life with Caleb as her foundation. What would happen if that foundation crumbled? The women's group rallied. Rachel organized a schedule where different women brought meals every evening. Sarah's husband David took over some of Caleb's ranch responsibilities temporarily. Mrs. Chen appeared one morning and simply started cleaning the house without asking permission, her presence a silent statement of support. "You helped build a community," Mrs. Chen said when Evelyn tried to thank her. "Community helps back. This is how it works." Slowly, painfully, Caleb recovered. It took months before he was strong enough to return to ranch work, and even then only part-time. The illness had aged him, left him weaker than before, forced both of them to confront the reality that they weren't young anymore and their bodies wouldn't sustain the grueling pace they'd maintained for 20 years. "We need to think about the future," Caleb said one evening when he was finally well enough to sit on the porch and watch the sunset again. "About what happens when we can't work like we used to." "Clara can take over the forge eventually," Evelyn said. "She's nearly ready now." "And us? What do we do when we're too old for this pace?" It was a question Evelyn had been avoiding, but Caleb's illness had made it unavoidable. They were both in their mid-40s now, had been working hard since their teens. The forge and the ranch had given them good lives, but they'd also taken a physical toll that was becoming harder to ignore. "We plan," Evelyn said finally. "We start training Clara to take full control of the forge. We save what we can. We build toward a time when we can work less and trust that we've created something sustainable." They started making changes. Clara took on more responsibility at the forge, managing customer relationships and handling increasingly complex projects. Evelyn stepped back to an advisory role, teaching and supervising rather than doing all the work herself. Caleb reduced his ranch hours with Wade's blessing, focusing on the tasks that didn't require the physical stamina he no longer possessed. The transition was harder than Evelyn anticipated. The forge had been her identity for so long that stepping back from it felt like losing part of herself. But she was also surprised to discover relief mixed with the loss. Relief at not carrying the full weight alone, relief at having time for things beyond just work and survival. She started attending church again, surprising herself and everyone else. Not because her beliefs had changed, but because it was one of the few places in K-Fax where the community gathered regularly, and she'd discovered that community mattered more than her pride. "Didn't think I'd ever see you in here again," Reverend Matthews said after the first service she attended in nearly 15 years. "Didn't think I'd ever want to come back," Evelyn admitted. "But things change, people change." "Indeed they do." The Reverend smiled. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're here, and I'm sorry if my words in the past ever made you feel unwelcome." The apology surprised her. "You remember that sermon about women abandoning traditional roles?" "I remember many sermons I wish I could take back." He looked genuinely regretful. "I was young, and certain I knew the right way for everyone to live. You've taught this town, taught me, that there are more right ways than I imagined." It wasn't absolution for all the hurt, but it was acknowledgement, and that mattered. Clara turned 20 and announced her engagement to a young man from a neighboring town who'd apprenticed at a furniture maker's shop and understood the satisfaction of working with one's hands. The wedding was small but joyful, and watching Clara marry someone who clearly adored her strength rather than being threatened by it made Evelyn's heart full to bursting. "You found your Caleb," Evelyn whispered to her daughter before the ceremony. "I found my Thomas," Claire corrected with a smile. "But yes, I found someone who sees me clearly and loves what he sees. James graduated from university and returned to K-Fax to teach at the small school, bringing with him progressive ideas about education that made some of the older residents uncomfortable but energized the younger generation. He boarded with Evelyn and Caleb while saving money for his own place, filling their house with intellectual discussion and infectious enthusiasm. The years had a way of accumulating weight and meaning. Evelyn watched her children build their own lives, watched the town slowly transform its opinions, watched the forge continue under Clara's increasingly capable management. She and Caleb settled into a rhythm that was less frantic than their early years, but no less purposeful, working when they could, resting when they needed to, grateful for every day that gave them both. When Caleb turned 55, his heart began giving him trouble. Nothing dramatic at first, just occasional pain and breathlessness that the doctor said was concerning but manageable. They adjusted their lives again, Caleb retiring fully from ranch work, spending his days in the garden, or working on small craft projects that didn't tax his heart. "I never thought I'd be the kind of man who retired," he said one afternoon, watching Evelyn work at the forge from his seat on the bench. "You're not retired. You're redirected." She set down her hammer and joined him on the bench. "Besides, you've earned rest. 25 years at Broken Creek, plus everything you've done here. That's more than most men accomplish in a lifetime." "I wish I had more time," he said quietly. "More years to spend with you." The words sent a chill through Evelyn despite the forge heat. "You're not dying." "We're all dying, love, just at different speeds." He took her hand, tracing the familiar scars and calluses. "I just want to make sure you know, in case I go first, that these years with you have been the best of my life. That I've never regretted a single moment of choosing you." "Don't talk like that," Evelyn said, her throat tight. "You're going to be fine." But 6 months later, on a quiet morning in spring when the valley was green and the air smelled of new grass, Caleb's heart simply stopped. He died in his sleep, peacefully, without pain or struggle, just went to sleep beside Evelyn and didn't wake up. The grief was a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn had lost her father, had endured hardship and rejection and years of struggle, but nothing had prepared her for the absence of Caleb. The space beside her in bed felt vast. The silence where his voice should be was deafening. The forge that had once been her sanctuary now felt empty without him stopping by to check on her work, to bring her lunch, to simply exist in her orbit. The town that had once judged her so harshly surprised her with its kindness. People brought food and flowers. Rachel sat with her for hours, saying nothing, just being present. Mrs. Chen made tea and told stories about her own husband's death years before, about how grief transformed but didn't destroy if you let yourself feel it fully. Even Mrs. Henderson offered stiff condolences, her face suggesting she understood that death stripped away petty grievances and left only the universal experience of loss. The funeral was well attended. Wade came from Broken Creek with several of the ranch hands, all of them looking uncomfortable in their Sunday clothes. The women's group attended in force. Clara and Thomas stood on one side of Evelyn, James on the other, all of them supporting her and each other. Reverend Matthews spoke kindly about Caleb, about his quiet strength and his devotion to his family, about the way he treated everyone with respect regardless of their station. But the words that mattered most to Evelyn came from Clara, who stood at the front of the church and spoke in a voice that only trembled slightly. "My father taught me that love doesn't require anyone to be less than they are," Clara said. "He showed me what it looks like when a man sees a woman's strength and celebrates it instead of fearing it. He proved that a good marriage is built on partnership and respect, not on one person diminishing themselves for the other's comfort. I hope to build a marriage like theirs. I hope to be half as brave in love as my father was." Evelyn wept then, the tears she'd been holding back since Caleb's death finally breaking through. She wept for the loss and for the love, for all the years they'd had, and all the years they'd been denied. She wept because Caleb had been right. They'd built something remarkable together, and his death didn't diminish that. It only proved how valuable it had been. The weeks after the funeral were the hardest. Evelyn moved through her days in a fog, going through the motions of living without really engaging with life. She worked at the forge because routine demanded it, but her heart wasn't in the work. She ate because people brought food and insisted. She slept because eventually exhaustion overcame even grief. But slowly, gradually, she began to resurface. Clara needed her help with a complex commission. James asked her opinion on a problem he was having at school. Rachel invited her to the women's group meeting, where the other women welcomed her back with gentle understanding. "Grief doesn't end," Mrs. Chen told her one afternoon over tea. "It just becomes part of you, like a scar. Still there, still tender sometimes, but also proof that you survived something that tried to break you." Evelyn learned to live with Caleb's absence the way she'd learned every other hard skill, through practice and determination and refusing to give up even when it would have been easier to stop trying. She found ways to honor his memory that felt true to who they'd been together. She wore the iron ring he'd made her and never took it off. She told stories about him to Clara's children when they came to visit, making sure the next generation knew their grandfather had been remarkable. And she kept working the forge because that had been part of their shared dream, that she would continue doing what she loved, that she wouldn't disappear into grief or give up the life they'd built together. By the time Evelyn reached 60, the forge had been passed primarily to Clara, though Evelyn still came by most days to advise on difficult projects or simply to be present in the space that had defined so much of her life. Her hands were more gnarled now, arthritis making the fine work harder, but she could still read metal by sight and sound, could still teach the principles she'd learned from her father and refined over 4 decades of practice. The town had changed around her. The woman who'd once been whispered about as unnatural and unmarriageable had become a respected elder, someone whose opinion carried weight. Young women came to her for advice about starting businesses or navigating the challenges of being competent in a world that still preferred women to be decorative. She'd never sought to be a symbol, but time and persistence had made her one anyway. One afternoon, a young woman appeared at the forge, barely 20, with nervous hands and determined eyes. "Mrs. Rowe, I'm Elizabeth. I came from Sacramento because I heard there was a woman here who runs her own blacksmith forge. I wanted to ask—" She paused, gathering courage. "I wanted to ask if you'd consider taking me on as an apprentice. I know it's unusual, but I'm willing to work hard, and I need to learn a trade that will support me." Evelyn looked at this young woman, seeing herself 40 years earlier, frightened but resolute, determined to build a life on her own terms despite the obstacles. She thought about her father, who'd given her the same chance, about Caleb, who'd supported her in claiming it, about Clara, who'd carried the tradition forward. "It's not unusual at all," Evelyn said. "In fact, it's exactly what this forge was built for. When can you start?" Elizabeth's face transformed with relief and joy. "Tomorrow? Today? Whenever you'll have me." "Tomorrow's fine. Come early. We start before dawn and work until the light's gone." Evelyn smiled. "And bring gloves. Your hands are going to hurt for the first few weeks until you build up calluses." Training Elizabeth felt like completing a circle that had started when Evelyn's father first handed her a hammer. She taught the young woman the same lessons she'd learned, refined by decades of experience. How to read the fire, how to judge heat, how to position your body to maximize efficiency. How to handle customers who didn't want to take you seriously, how to price your work fairly, how to build a reputation one good piece at a time. But she also taught lessons her father hadn't known to teach her. How to navigate being a woman in a male profession without apologizing for your existence. How to find the people who would support you and ignore the ones who wouldn't. How to build a life that honored both your ambitions and your other needs. How to be strong without being brittle. How to be independent without being isolated. "Did you ever regret it?" Elizabeth asked one day during a break. "Choosing this life? It must have been so hard being the only woman doing this work." Evelyn considered the question seriously. "There were days I wished things were easier. Days when I was tired of fighting to be taken seriously, tired of being judged for every choice I made. But regret? No. This life has been hard, but it's been mine. I've built things with my own hands. I've supported myself and my family. I've proven that women can do this work just as well as men. And I've helped change what this town thinks is possible for women. That's worth all the hard days." "You made it possible for me to even imagine doing this," Elizabeth said quietly. "If you hadn't succeeded, I don't think I would have had the courage to try." "Then do me proud," Evelyn said. "Learn well, work hard, and when the time comes, teach someone else. That's how we build a world where women like us don't have to be quite so brave. because enough of us were brave before them. Evelyn's 70th birthday brought unexpected recognition. The town organized a celebration in her honor, acknowledging her 4 decades of service to the community and her role in expanding what was possible for women in KFAX. Even Mrs. Henderson attended, ancient now and softened by time, and offered a grudging admission that perhaps she'd been too harsh in her early judgments. "You proved me wrong," the old woman said, her voice papery with age. "I didn't think a woman could maintain a business and a family, both. But you did. And you did it well." It wasn't quite an apology, but coming from Mrs. Henderson, it was as close as anyone was likely to get. Evelyn stood before the assembled townspeople, many of whom had known her entire adult life, some of whom were too young to remember when she'd been scandalous, and spoke from her heart. "When I was 22 and my father died, I thought I had 2 choices," she said. "Give up the forge and conform to what everyone expected of me, or keep the forge and accept a life of isolation and judgment. But I was wrong. There was a third choice, to keep the forge and refuse to accept that being competent meant being alone, to find people who could see my strength as beautiful instead of threatening, to build a life that was fully mine without giving up the possibility of love and family and community." She looked around the room, finding familiar faces. Clara with her growing family, James with his students, Rachel, who'd been one of her first real friends in this town, Mrs. Chen, whose wisdom had sustained her through countless difficult moments, the spaces where Caleb and her father and others she'd loved should have been, but weren't, their absence a permanent ache. "I'm grateful for this life," she continued, "for every hard-won success and every lesson learned through failure, for the people who supported me, and yes, even for the people who challenged me, because they forced me to become stronger and more certain of my own worth. But most of all, I'm grateful that I lived true to myself, that I didn't shrink down to fit someone else's vision of what a woman should be. And I hope that my example has made it even slightly easier for the women coming after me to do the same." The applause was genuine and prolonged. Evelyn accepted it with grace, feeling both proud and humbled, aware that her life had become larger than just her own experience. She'd become part of a story about what was possible, about how one person's courage could help shift an entire community's understanding. She lived another 5 years after that celebration, long enough to see Elizabeth become a skilled blacksmith in her own right, long enough to hold Clara's first grandchild and tell the baby stories about the great-grandfather she'd never meet, long enough to watch James become headmaster of the school and transform education in the valley, long enough to see the women's group grow into a genuine force for change in KFAX, advocating for property rights and business opportunities and expanded roles for women. She died peacefully in her sleep on a winter morning, 75 years old, and satisfied that she'd lived well and fully. Clara found her in the bed she'd shared with Caleb for so many years, the iron ring still on her finger, a slight smile on her face as if she'd died dreaming of something pleasant. The funeral was the largest KFAX had ever seen. People came from 3 counties over, former customers, women she'd mentored, men who'd learned that strength in a woman was nothing to fear. The church overflowed, with people standing in the aisles and gathered outside the doors. Clara spoke about her mother with pride and love, her voice steady despite her tears. "My mother taught me that being true to yourself isn't selfish. It's the most generous thing you can do, because when you live authentically, you give other people permission to do the same. She showed me that strength and love aren't opposites, that you can be powerful and tender, independent and connected. She proved that a woman doesn't have to choose between being herself and being loved. She just has to find someone brave enough to love all of who she is." James spoke about lessons learned at his mother's knee, about how she'd supported his path even though it diverged from hers, about how she'd taught him that the measure of a person wasn't their strength, but their courage, in using that strength for something meaningful. Elizabeth spoke as well, representing the generation of women who'd followed in Evelyn's wake. "She didn't just teach me blacksmithing," Elizabeth said. "She taught me that my life could be whatever I was brave enough to build, that I didn't need anyone's permission to pursue my dreams, that being different wasn't the same as being wrong. Those lessons changed everything for me. I suspect they changed everything for a lot of us." They buried Evelyn beside Caleb in the town cemetery where her father also rested. The headstone was simple but exact. Evelyn Hart Rowe, blacksmith, wife, mother, pioneer. Strong until the end. The forge continued under Clara's management, and eventually under Clara's daughter after her. Hart's Forge became a legacy that passed through generations of women, each one adding their own innovations while honoring the foundation Evelyn had laid. The building itself became a landmark, a place where young women came to see proof that they could build lives outside traditional boundaries. Years later, when historians came to document the changing roles of women in Western territories, they found Evelyn's story woven through the records of K-Fax. Not because she'd led protests or demanded rights, but because she'd simply lived, openly, courageously, refusing to accept that her strength made her unworthy of love or community or success. The town that had once rejected her eventually claimed her as one of its proudest citizens. The woman they'd called unnatural became the woman they celebrated as a pioneer. The blacksmith who'd worked alone in her forge, swallowing insults like hot coals, became the founder of a legacy that would outlive everyone who'd ever doubted her. And somewhere in the ongoing story of K-Fax, in the sound of hammers ringing on anvils and the sight of women working confidently at trades their grandmothers had been told they couldn't master, Evelyn's lesson endured. Real love doesn't rewrite you, it recognizes you. And the life you build being fully yourself is worth more than any amount of approval won by being less than you are. Her story became proof that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to walk forward despite it. That strength isn't about being hard. It's about being resilient enough to bend without breaking. That a woman the town wouldn't claim could become the woman the town would never forget, simply by refusing to accept that her difference made her less than worthy of everything life had to offer. The forge still stands, its anvil worn smooth by generations of use, its fire still burning hot and true. And every woman who learns the craft there carries forward the lesson Evelyn lived. You don't need permission to be yourself. You just need the courage to keep being yourself even when the world insists you should be someone else. That was Evelyn Hart Rowe's greatest gift. Not the horseshoes she shaped or the ironwork she created, but the path she forged for everyone who came after. A path that proved love and strength could coexist. That being fully yourself didn't mean being alone. That the woman the town tried to shame could become the woman whose life inspired generations. In the end, she'd built more than a forge and a family. She'd built a legacy of possibility, hammered out one brave choice at a time, strong enough to outlast every voice that had told her she was wrong for being exactly what she was. And that legacy would endure long after the last person who'd known her personally was gone, carried forward by every woman who looked at her story and thought, if she could do it, maybe I can too.